Welcome back, brothers, to Amalur. Tonight's story, we got the return of the Tyranids. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you'll see in the future. Be sure to subscribe from the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it like always. Now, let's get into the madness.
Varos hung beneath its bruised red star like a clot in the throat of the void. The forge world did not turn so much as grind. Its rotation dragged continents of iron beneath skies the color of old blood, past manufactorum ranges large enough to swallow cities and furnace stacks tall enough to spear low cloud. Smoke poured from a million chimneys in black rivers, rising into a poisoned atmosphere where ash storms rolled like funeral cloth over hive spires, ore fields, slave pits, and temple foundries. The oceans had died before the oldest mortal on Varos had drawn breath. In their place lay chemical seas, slick with promethium runoff and corpse fat, where things without names twitched beneath the rainbow scum. From orbit, Varos looked alive. It was not. It was a carcass that had learned industry. Beneath its crust, in the buried heat of its tectonic wounds, demon engines were birthed in chain-bound foundries. Their iron bones were hammered by mortal slaves, whose hands had been replaced by riveting claws, whose eyelids had been cut away so they could better witness the glory of damnation. Their screams were fed through brass horns into the manufactorum cathedrals, not because the screams improved the labor, but because the masters of Varos enjoyed the music. The slave pits ringed the equator in broken black bands. Millions of mortals, mutants, and cult thralls labored there under the lash, beneath the gaze of gun servitors and skull-masked overseers. Some had been born in chains. Some had worn imperial uniforms before raids had dragged them screaming into the holds of the Ashen Moor. Some still whispered prayers to the throne in the dark, pressing shaking fingers to hidden Aquila tattoos until the overseers found them and peeled the skin away. The Chaos Space Marines did not care what the slaves believed. Belief was a luxury. Obedience was all that mattered. The Ashen Moor ruled Varos from the Basilica of Cinders, a fortress cathedral raised from adamantium, black basalt, and the fused armor plates of conquered tanks. Its towers were crowned with flayed banners that snapped in the furnace wind. Its gates were made from the prows of imperial warships broken in void battle and dragged to the surface by gravitic chains. Within its walls, the Warband feasted, armed, plotted, and remembered grievances older than the bloodlines of most imperial sectors. Varrock Threx, called the Crownless Butcher by his own warriors, and the Ash Lord by those mortals who wished to live another hour, sat upon a throne of welded ceramite and skulls. He wore warplate the color of burned bone and blackened brass. Chains hung from his pauldrons, each link engraved with the name of a world he had raided. A cloak of tanned faces fell from his shoulders. Some of the faces still had their eyes, preserved by the sorceries of Malachor Vare, so that they might weep black tears whenever Varrock walked to war. His helm rested beside him, a tusked thing with a vox grill shaped like a snarling furnace mouth. Without it, his face was pale, scarred and hard as a carved death mask. His scalp was bare. Ritual nails studded his brow in a crown that had never been granted by any Primarch, Warmaster, or God. He had named himself Lord because every rival who had objected had died with his tongue nailed to the basilica doors. Before him, the victory ceremony reached its sacred moment. Captured imperial officers knelt in a line upon the bloodstones. Their uniforms were torn, their medals still pinned to their chests by some mocking indulgence of the Warband. They had commanded a fortress moon beyond the Gathalamor reach. They had held for 6 days against traitor assault, which was 5 days longer than Varrock had expected, and 5 days more than he was willing to forgive. The warriors of the Ashen Moor watched from the steps and balconies of the hall. Some stood in silence, hulking shapes in scarred power armor. Others growled through helm speakers, impatient for the kill. The mortal slaves packed into the lower galleries were chained neck to neck, forced to look down upon the ceremony. Servo skulls drifted through the incense fog, recording every twitch of fear. Varrock rose. The hall quieted. Even the demon-bound braziers seemed to gutter low. He descended the steps with a chain blade in one hand and a bolt pistol in the other. The first officer looked up at him and spat blood. "For the Emperor," the man said. Varrock stopped before him. For a moment, there was only the furnace wind moaning through the high arches. Then the Chaos Lord laughed. It was not loud. That made it worse. "For the Emperor," Varrock repeated, tasting the words as if they were spoiled meat. "A corpse on a throne, a lie wrapped in gold, a god too dead to protect you and too hungry to let your souls go." The officer tried to answer. Varrock put the bolt pistol to his mouth and fired. The back of the man's skull burst across the kneeling prisoners behind him. Bone fragments clicked against medals and teeth. Brain matter slapped wetly across the stones. The corpse remained upright for a breath, smoke curling from the ruin above its jaw, then folded forward in a heap. The slaves in the galleries flinched as one. Varrock turned his head toward them. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying through the vox horns, "this is not punishment. This is history." He moved down the line. He did not kill quickly again. The second officer died under the chain blade, opened from groin to throat in a red spray that painted Varrock's armor. The third had his ribs cracked apart by the Chaos Lord's gauntlets until his chest became a broken cage. The fourth screamed for his men, then screamed for his mother, then made only choking sounds as Varrock dragged his entrails across the floor and cast them into the slave galleries. The warriors of the Ashen Moor watched without pity. Some were amused, some were bored, some saw only weakness being corrected. Korvac's red hand leaned against a pillar carved from the leg bone of a void leviathan, his crimson armor alive with dried gore and fresh scratches. Brass icons of the blood god hung from his belt. His chain axe purred in his fist like a predator begging for release. "This theater grows thin," Korvax growled. "Give me ships, give me worlds, give me a line of loyalist dogs, and I will build you a mountain of skulls high enough to shame the gods." Dragon Mole stood nearby, vast and iron grey, a warsmith with a face hidden behind a brutal helm of riveted plates. Servo arms twitched over his shoulders, each ending in a tool that could mend a cannon or gut a prisoner. He watched the ceremony through red optic lenses, not with reverence, but with calculation. "You would spend our strength on another raid, while Varos bleeds resources through every seam," Dragon said. His voice was a metallic rasp, filtered through old augmetics. "The eastern shield bastions are decayed. The orbital batteries require new capacitors. 3 furnace districts have fallen behind tithe. Conquest without fortification is vanity." Korvax turned slowly. "Speak that word again, Iron Carrion." "Vanity," Dragon said. The warriors near them shifted, hungry for a duel. None came. Not yet. Varrock allowed rivalry. He did not allow disorder unless it entertained him. Malachor Vare watched from the shadow of a broken saint statue. The sorcerer's armor was midnight blue beneath layers of parchment, brass chains and eye-shaped charms. His helm hung at his hip, leaving his gaunt face bare. Tattoos crawled across his scalp as if worms moved beneath the ink. His eyes were black from edge to edge, and his lips moved constantly in silent arguments, with voices only he could hear. He did not watch the dying officers. He watched the smoke above the braziers. It bent against the wind. It bent toward the eastern void. Nerez Halvek, the apothecary butcher, noticed. He noticed everything that trembled, bled, spawned, or died. His white armor had long ago become the color of old ivory soaked in rust. Red lenses stared from his helm. His narthecium claws flexed with delicate anticipation. "You see omens again," Nerez said. Malachor's mouth tightened. "I see pressure. From the warp? No." That single word carried enough unease that even Korvax glanced over. Varrock finished the last officer by crushing his skull underfoot. The man's head collapsed with a sound like a fruit bursting under a tank tread. The Chaos Lord looked down at the ruin, then up at the chained masses. "Mercy died 10,000 years ago," he said. "You live because we permit your labor. You breathe because breath serves us. You breed because bodies are required for the foundries. Forget hope. Hope is an imperial disease." The slaves did not cheer. They knew better. The warriors did. Their voices rolled through the Basilica of Cinders in a thunder of vox distortion, chain weapons and gauntlets hammered against armor. The sound was still rising when the first alarm screamed. It came as a howl through the chamber vox, distorted by distance and panic. Varrock turned toward the strategium doors. Dragon was already moving. "Report." The vox spirit answered in bursts of static. A mortal voice bled through, ragged and terrified. "Outer moon convoy translating in system. Late arrival. Severe hull trauma. No challenge response. No identification beyond slave registry. Lord, they are drifting." "Drifting," Varrock said. "Punctured, Lord. Open to void in multiple sections. Life signs corrupted. Auspex returns are foul." Korvax laughed. "Raiders? No heraldry detected. No engine signatures matching Imperial, Greenskin, Eldar, or known renegade pattern." Malachor closed his eyes. The crawling tattoos on his scalp darkened. Varrock looked at him. "Speak, witch." The sorcerer inhaled through clenched teeth. "Something comes before the ships." "What?" Silence. The strategium of the Basilica awakened around them. Hololithic projectors burned to life, casting the Varos system in red and amber light. The Forge world rotated at the center, surrounded by its moons, dockyards, defense platforms, and debris fields. At the edge of the projection drifted the slave convoy from Gorak Tertius. Its icons flickered with damage runes. Around them, faint clouds bloomed like stains in water. Dragon magnified the image. "Spore matter." Nerez stepped closer. "Organic?" "Unknown." Malachor whispered. "Known." The first recording came through broken and wet. It was from the lead slave hauler. Its bridge-picked feed shuddered in darkness. A mortal overseer clung to a command lectern, while red emergency lumen strips strobed around him. Behind him, crewmen were fused to their stations by veined, pale growths that pulsed like diseased organs. One man was still alive, or seemed to be, his mouth stretched wide around a choking mass of black fibers. He beat his skull against the console until his forehead opened and blood streamed into his eyes. The overseer looked into the lens. "By the gods," he sobbed. "By the gods, something ate through the hull." A shape moved behind him. Not a warrior, not a demon, not a man. The picked feed became screaming. Dragon replayed the final frames at reduced speed. Chitin, talons, a wet flash of sinew, a mouth opening sideways where no mouth should have been. "No demands," Dragon said. "No boarding proclamation, no Vox challenge." "No fear," Korvax said, and there was something like hunger in his tone. Nerez leaned close to the hololith. "Recover the vessels. I want the dead and the living. Seal them in quarantine pens. Burn any crew that cannot walk." "Your curiosity will gut us one day," Dragon said. "My curiosity has rebuilt warriors you would have thrown into corpse furnaces. My furnaces are useful. So are my corpses." Varrock ignored them. His gaze remained upon the faint clouds gathering beyond the outer moon. "Malachor." The sorcerer had already drawn a blade across his palm. Black blood welled up and rose from the wound instead of falling, forming beads that hung in the air before his face. He whispered in the tongue of the warp. The braziers dimmed. The chamber walls seemed to lean inward. Mortal officers in the galleries began to retch and pray. Malachor opened his mind. He expected the laughter of demons. He expected the whispering thirst of the gods. He expected prophecy to arrive clothed in lies, as it always did. Instead, he found an ocean, It was vast beyond reason, blacker than the void, deeper than the warp. It did not whisper. It did not bargain. It did not tempt. It pressed. It swallowed. It filled his skull with the sensation of drowning beneath a sea made of hunger. Within that ocean were teeth, not mouths, not beasts. Teeth without number, moving in patterns too immense for hatred and too perfect for rage. Every tooth was a life. Every life was a weapon. Every weapon was a cell inside a greater body that thought only in consumption. Malachor screamed. His eyes burst black tears. The blood floating before him boiled away. He staggered, and Neres caught him with a clinical grip. "What did you see?" the apothecary butcher asked. Malachor shoved him away and struck the floor with one knee. His breath came in animal gasps. "No gods," he said. "No demons, no souls to flay, no minds to break." Korvac spat. "Then it is prey." Malachor looked up, and for the first time in centuries, the sorcerer looked afraid. "It is hunger wearing flesh." Varrock descended from the strategium dais. His boots crushed the last scraps of Imperial officer beneath him. Blood trailed after him, dark and thick. "All things hunger," he said. "All things bleed. All things scream. Therefore all things can be ruled." The words steadied the chamber, because they were spoken with absolute certainty. Certainty was a weapon among the damned. It could make slaves march into fire and make ancient murderers kneel. Across the hololith, the outermost moon of Varos began to disappear. At first, the change looked like cloud cover. A pale, living haze spread across the curve of Gorak Ultima, swallowing mining lights, orbital mirrors, and fortress beacons. Then the haze thickened. Mycetic spores descended in continent-wide storms. Bioships moved through the void above the moon, vast shapes of shell, tendon, and hardened cartilage, their silhouettes like predatory gods born in some lightless abyss. They did not form a fleet in any naval sense. They drifted, clustered, opened and seeded. The moon beneath them became a wound. Defense lasers fired upward. Some beams struck home, boiling craters in living hulls. Others vanished into spore clouds. Macro shells burst among descending organisms and killed thousands. Millions more fell. The moon's vox traffic became a choir of collapse. Contact at the refinery gates. Seal the lower shafts. Something is in the water tanks. My lord, the dead are moving because they are full of smaller things. Burn the pit. Burn the pit. Burn the pit. Then the astropathic relay died. Its final transmission was not words, but a psychic shriek that made every mortal in the strategium fall to his knees. Several slaves convulsed until their spines snapped. One officer clawed out his own eyes before a gun servitor pulped him with a burst of heavy shells. Varrock watched the moon vanish beneath the living storm. "A Xenos raid," Korvac said. "A large one." Dregon's servo arms clicked. "No, a harvest." Varrock turned away from the hololith. "Then we shall teach the harvesters that Varos has teeth." The strategium doors opened. Two iron thralls dragged in a captured cultist from the late convoy. He had once been a strong man, swollen by mutation and branded with the sigil of the Ashen Moor across his chest. Now he was grey, shaking and slick with sweat. His belly bulged beneath torn robes. Something moved under the skin. Neres stepped forward, intrigued. "Hold him down." The cultist looked past the apothecary, past the warsmith, past the sorcerer, and fixed his pleading eyes on Varrock Threx. "Lord," he whispered, "it is inside the meat." His jaw stretched, his throat convulsed. He vomited a fist-sized organism onto the strategium floor. The thing hit the bloodstones with a wet slap. It was pale, blind and all teeth, its small body slick with bile and threaded with twitching feeder tendrils. It snapped at the air. Neres bent toward it. The cultist's ribs split open from inside. Bone spears tore through flesh. His chest burst in a hot spray of blood, organs and writhing white larvae. The iron thralls staggered back as the man came apart, not dying so much as opening, his body reduced to a gate through which the first true hunger of the void came crawling. Gorak Tertius had always been dying. It was a mining moon, if such a sterile wound could still be granted the dignity of a name. Its mountains had been hollowed to ribs. Its seas had been boiled away and replaced by industrial sumps, blood pits, run-off lakes, and endless settling basins of grey sludge. The ashen moor had cracked its mantle centuries ago and fed the exposed veins of ore into the demon foundries of Varos. What remained of the moon was a tortured ball of tunnels, open pits, refinery bastions, gun towers, and slave barracks stacked in rusting tiers beneath a sky the color of bruised iron. Billions labored there, slave miners with chain brands burned into their cheeks, mutants bred in darkness, hunched and thick-limbed, their backs bent by generations beneath the lash. Penal soldiers taken from conquered worlds and given rifles older than their grandfathers. Cult thralls who carved the sigil of the ashen moor into their own flesh and called the wound devotion. Demon-forged labor engines, blind and immense, dragged ore sledges through the black dust on piston legs, their furnace hearts beating behind cages of brass and bone. When the order came from Varos, it came without comfort. Hold the surface, no promise of extraction, no blessing, no lie about honor. Hold the surface until relieved or dead. Scepter Vos stood upon the command gantry of Bastion Karth, watching the eastern horizon vanish behind spore cloud and fire. He was immortal, though no slave dared call him such. He wore a long coat of flayed grok's hide, reinforced with strips of black iron. His left arm had been replaced at the elbow by a clicking augmetic ending in command talons. His right eye was a red lens screwed into scar tissue. A collar of obedience iron circled his throat, not because Varric Threx distrusted him more than any other servant, but because the Chaos Lord trusted no living thing unless it could be punished. Vos commanded the mortal defense lines because the Ashen Moor had more important matters for its warriors. That was the truth. He had learned long ago that truth had sharp edges, and a careful man handled it with gloves. The slaves were ammunition, ammunition that happened to scream, ammunition that could be ordered to reload itself, dig its own trenches, hold a lass rifle, absorb a charge, choke a tunnel with its own dead. A bolt shell was valuable. A mutant work gang was not. A Chaos Space Marine would mourn the loss of a relic blade before he noticed the extinction of 1,000,000 chained men. Vos understood this. He had survived by understanding it. "First trench belt reports movement," said Overseer Marek from the Vox pit below. "No clear count. Auspex returns are unstable." "All returns have been unstable since the spore fall," Vos said. "The men are asking for confirmation of relief." Vos looked down at him. Marek swallowed. "I will tell them to keep firing." "You will tell them nothing. Fear makes them inventive. Hope makes them lazy." Beyond the bastion walls, the first rain began. It was not water. Nothing so clean had touched Gorak Tertius in centuries. Mycetic spores fell from the sky in tumbling masses, some the size of ammunition crates, some the size of hab blocks, some so vast that their descent made the clouds bulge around them. They struck the ground with wet thunder. They burst open across minefields, trenchworks and worker camps, disgorging steam, slime and things that unfolded too quickly for the eye to understand. Others did not burst. They melted, spreading across rockcrete and ash as corrosive pools that smoked through boots, bone and metal alike. The first screams came from the outer labor pits. Vos magnified his ocular lens. He saw men clawing at their throats as the air filled with invisible poison. Choking toxins rolled low through the trenches, pale as corpse breath. Penal soldiers tore away rebreathers that had clogged with living threads. Mutants vomited black fluid through tusked mouths. A gun crew tried to drag a macro shell into position and fell one by one, their bodies twitching as tiny feeder organisms entered their ears and nostrils. Then came the gargoyles. They descended through the smoke like torn scraps of night-given claws. Wings of stretched membrane beat over lean bodies and barbed tails. Flesh borers spat living ammunition into the trench lines. Men jerked and burst as beetle-shaped organisms chewed through armor, rib and lung. One slave miner stumbled across an ammunition platform with both hands pressed to his face. He made it 3 steps before his skull split at the eye sockets, and a knot of burrowing things spilled down his chest. "Flak towers," Voss said. "All batteries. Drown the sky." The moon answered. Autocannon arrays mounted on refinery spires roared upward. Flak bursts blackened the cloud deck. Gargoyles vanished in sprays of ichor and torn membrane, falling in burning heaps across the trench lines. Macro cannons opened from the ridge bastions, their recoil shaking dust from the command gantry. Mining lasers, repurposed for war, lanced into the descending spore masses and carved them open in molten arcs. Whole clouds of gaunts were shredded before they touched the ground. For a time, the defense looked like victory. The outer plains became a meat grinder. Hormagaunts charged in bounding tides, scything talons held wide, jaws open in silent hunger. Heavy stubbers and lasfire cut them down by the thousand, then by the tens of thousands, then by numbers too large to matter. Their bodies piled before the first trench belt, chitin cracking under the weight of those that came after. The dead became ramps, the ramps became bridges. The living ran over the fallen and struck the trenches in a wave of claws. Voss watched penal soldiers vanish beneath the impact. He heard the Voxnet collapse into prayers, curses, and wet gargling. He heard a sergeant screaming for more ammunition until something dragged him backward through a firing slit and left both his arms behind. "Second belt," Voss said. "Fire through the first." Marek stared at him. "Our men are still there. They are already dead. Prove useful before you join them." The second belt opened fire. Heavy bolters and mining lasers scythed through gaunts and slaves alike. The first trench became a red ditch, boiling with alien bodies and human pieces. It slowed the swarm for 11 breaths. Then the ground began to move. Rippers came through the vents first. They poured from drainage grates, pipe mouths, sump channels and cracks in the rockcrete. Small, many-legged, blind with appetite, they swarmed over men in rippling carpets. They entered wounds. They entered mouths. They forced themselves under armor plates and through eye sockets. A cult thrall with the 8-pointed star branded across his bare chest laughed as he swung a cleaver into the swarm, calling upon the gods to witness him. His laughter became a choking squeal when the rippers climbed into his open mouth and distended his throat until it tore. At the western refinery, a demon-forged labor engine tried to stamp them flat. The rippers climbed its piston legs, found gaps in the brass plating, and poured inside. The engine shrieked with the voice bound in its furnace heart. It toppled, rupturing, its caged soul howling as feeder organisms gnawed at meat that had not been mortal for 100 years. Voss felt sweat crawl beneath his collar. The obedience iron warmed, sensing the tremor in his pulse. "Where are the legionaries?" he asked. As if in answer, the sky above the third trench belt split with fire. Dropcraft came in low, black hulls scarred with old battle damage, engines screaming through poisoned cloud. They did not land. They opened their assault ramps while still in motion. Figures fell from them like armored idols hurled by angry gods. Korvac's red hand struck the battlefield at the head of his butcher pack. The Kornati champion landed knee-deep in alien corpses, crimson armor steaming with spore rain. His chain axe roared as he rose. Around him came the warriors of his claw, massive in corrupted ceramite, helms horned and brass-bound, chain blades and axes already revving. Their vox grills vomited laughter, oaths, and murder chants. "Blood for the blood god," Korvax bellowed, and the sound rolled across the dying trenches like artillery. "Skulls for the skull throne. Come then, meet. Come and be counted." The Hormagaunts came. Korvax met them laughing. His chain axe carved the first beast from crown to pelvis, spitting purple ichor across his chestplate. He shoulder-charged the next hard enough to shatter its carapace, then stamped its skull into paste. His warriors followed in a red wedge, hacking and firing at point-blank range. Bolt shells detonated inside gaunt bodies, blasting chitin outward in wet flowers. Chain blades chewed limbs away. Power fists crushed thoraxes. One Chaos Marine caught a leaping Hormagaunt by the throat, slammed it into the ground and tore its head free with a twist of his wrist. For a moment, the swarm broke around them. Not in fear, never in fear. It broke as water breaks around stone. Korvax did not see the difference at first. None of them did. Chaos was used to the moment when enemies faltered, when morale cracked, when men threw down weapons and ran, when commanders begged, when terror became another blade in the Warband's hand. The Ashen Maw had conquered worlds by making populations fear what would happen after defeat more than death itself. The Tyranids gave them nothing. They did not recoil from trophies. They did not hesitate before skull racks. They did not slow when Korvax impaled a gaunt on a banner pole and roared his triumph into the smoke. They did not care when bodies burst. They did not hear insults. They did not understand domination. They came on because the will behind them commanded motion, and motion served hunger. At squad scale, the Chaos Marines were nightmares, each one killed with the force of a battle tank and the savagery of a torture chamber. The ground around Korvax became a widening circle of alien dead, but the circle kept filling. Voss saw it from the gantry. He saw the truth before the warriors below wanted to admit it. They were killing thousands and achieving nothing. "New contacts," Marek said, voice cracking. "Larger beasts, North Ridge, East Pit, beneath the refinery pipes." The Auspex screens flared. Shapes emerged through the spore fog. Tyranid warriors moved with dreadful purpose, taller than men, blades grown from their own limbs, carapaces slick with chemical rain. Around them, the lesser organisms changed. The gaunts that had been scattered by artillery began to flow. Their charges bent around burning promethium trenches. They avoided collapsed killing fields and surged toward ammunition lifts, vox masts, and slave barracks. Gargoyles stopped circling aimlessly and struck flak towers in coordinated packs. Rippers abandoned corpses and poured into generator houses. Synapse. Voss did not know the word as the Magi biologists might know it, but he understood command. He understood when mobs became armies. A distant zoanthrope drifted above the refinery ruins, its swollen cranium pulsing with pale witchlight. Men beneath it died without being touched. Their helmets crumpled inward. Their eyes burst. Their brains leaked from their nostrils as if squeezed by invisible fists. Malachor Vair's voice entered the command vox, thin with strain. "Do not look at the floating ones for too long, mortal." Voss stiffened. "Lord Sorcerer, where is Varrock?" "In orbit, receiving reports from all fronts." "Then send this to him, and pray your tongue does not fail you. The enemy is not taking ground. It is removing resistance from the meal." Before Voss could answer, a private channel opened. Varrock Threx spoke through it, his voice distorted by distance and battle command. "Say that again, witch." Malachor's reply came with a hiss of static and pain. "The moon is not besieged in the manner of men. It is being butchered. Every assault has purpose beyond slaughter. They strike vents, water reserves, corpse pits, flesh stores, breeding pens, atmosphere processors. They are not conquering Gorak Tertius. They are eating it as a butcher strips flesh from bone." Korvax cut into the channel, laughing beneath the shriek of his chain axe. "Then let them choke on us." "They will not choke," Malachor said. Far below Bastion Karth, in a sealed quarantine chamber already slick with blood, Nerez Halvek learned the same lesson in another language. The apothecary butcher stood among restraint tables and stasis cages, while his thralls dragged living specimens from the battlefield. Gaunts with severed limbs still snapped at iron clamps. Rippers chewed through their own restraints until Neres burned their mouths away with a surgical torch. A gargoyle hung from hooks, wings shredded, its chest opening and closing too fast for any natural respiration. Neres injected toxin into a Hormagaunt's exposed artery. The beast convulsed and died. He repeated the dose on another specimen captured later in the same hour. It convulsed, thrashed, then steadied. "Interesting," he murmured. He increased the dose. The creature foamed ichor and lived for another minute. The next specimen lived longer. Neres turned to a bound thrall. "Record all changes in organ coloration, adrenal response, clotting speed, and nerve reaction." The thrall bent to the slate with shaking hands. A caged feeder organism slammed against the bars again and again, splitting its own skull. It did not stop. Neres looked at the battlefield sample set and saw patterns moving faster than reason should allow. Thickened membranes near toxin entry points. Chitin darkened where bolt fragments had failed to penetrate cleanly. Acidic saliva, altering after exposure to warp-tainted residue from demon engine exhaust. Not corruption, not possession. Response. Adaptation. The apothecary felt something close to joy curdle into revulsion. "You are learning," he said to the blind alien things. "That is unacceptable." On the surface, the second trench belt vanished beneath claws. Voss ordered the third to fire. The third fired until gargoyles fell upon them from above and rippers came from below. Slave barracks became slaughter pens. Men hacked at walls to escape, only to find more organisms waiting in the corridors. Penal soldiers formed firing squares around ammunition dumps, buying minutes with blood. Mutants fought with picks, blades and teeth until living ammunition burrowed into their stomachs and detonated in ropes of steaming intestine. Korvax and his warriors pushed toward the North Ridge, still killing, still laughing, but the laughter had become strained. A Tyranid warrior caught one of his brothers through the chest with paired bone swords and lifted him from the ground. The Chaos Marine fired his bolter into the beast's face until the magazine clicked dry. The warrior died. 3 Hormagaunts climbed the impaled legionary before he could free himself and tore through the seals at his gorget. His head came away in a gout of blood and black cables. Korvax split the warrior's corpse apart and roared at the sky. The sky answered with more spores. By the time Gorak Tertius entered its final hours, the horizon had changed shape. Capillary towers rose from the plains where the spore rain had first fallen. They grew with obscene speed, not built, but extruded, thrusting upward from digestion fields of liquefied bodies, or slurry and dissolved machinery. Their surfaces pulsed with peristaltic motion. Veins the size of hab tunnels carried rendered biomass upward. Around their bases, feeder organisms swarmed through corpse rivers, stripping flesh from bone, metal from meat, chemical value from poison. The blood pits of the moon emptied first. They had been vast reservoirs where the ashen moor drained sacrificial waste from the slave cities, lakes of clotted red and black beneath iron grates. Now they churned as Tyranid feeder systems drank them dry. Then the runoff seas began to sink. Then the subterranean water reserves. Then the slurry tanks, the corpse furnaces, the algae vats, the breeding pens, the meat lockers, the dead, the dying, the living. From orbit, the moon looked as if pale roots had pierced it and begun sucking it hollow. Voss remained on the gantry until Bastion Karth shook beneath him. A crack opened across the command floor. Hot wind breathed up through it, carrying the smell of acid and wet chitin. Men ran. Voss shot 2 of them with his pistol and let the others go because his magazine was almost empty. The Vox was no longer a net. It was a graveyard of broken voices. "Surface command to Varos," he said. "Gorak Tertius is compromised. Repeat, compromised. Enemy organisms have breached all primary belts. Capillary growths across all visible sectors. Request immediate extraction of command personnel." Static answered. Then Varric Threx. "Hold the surface.
Voss laughed once. It escaped him before he could stop it. The obedience collar burned into his throat. "Yes, Lord," he rasped. Outside, the mining moon cracked open. Not metaphorically, not as poetry. Its crust split under the pressure of burrowing monsters and growing towers, long wounds of red heat spreading across its tortured face. Capillary towers drank from those wounds, feeding oceans, blood, slaves, mutants, ore dust, corpse fat, and industrial filth into the waiting bioships above. Gorak Tertius died screaming. The Tyranids did not listen. The survivors returned to Varos in ships that bled. They came down through the bruised red light of the system star in ragged formations, their engines coughing plasma, their hulls torn open and sealed with emergency plates, their flanks burned by acid and scored by talons large enough to carve through void-hardened adamantium. Slave haulers that had departed Gorak Tertius, heavy with ammunition and chained bodies, came back as crippled coffins. Assault craft limped alongside them, their machine spirits howling through vox static, their holds filled with wounded legionaries, infected mortals, and fragments of armor that still steamed with alien digestive fluids. The landing fields beneath the Basilica of Cinders became charnel yards. Thralls in iron masks dragged bodies from the holds, while gun servitors watched for signs of mutation, cowardice, or Xenos contamination. Men who could walk were ordered into quarantine cages. Men who could not walk were hooked through the
ribs and hauled screaming across the black stone. Some were not men any longer. Their bellies shifted. Their skin bulged in places where things moved beneath the flesh. One penal sergeant kept saluting even after a feeder larva chewed through his cheek from the inside and dropped from his mouth in a string of blood and spit. Nerez Halvek walked among them like a priest at a feast. The apothecary butcher had forbidden the corpse furnaces from burning anything until he had examined it. His narthecium clicked and hissed. Servo arms plucked samples from wounds, peeled armor from bodies, and cracked open rib cages with delicate precision. He found Tyranid larvae curled in stomachs, nestled beneath lungs, chewing through marrow. He found fragments of chitin embedded in ceramite, still growing, still secreting acid into the armor that had failed to kill them. He found a Chaos Marine from Korvax's assault pack, whose breastplate had been half digested while the warrior still lived. The legionary's torso was exposed from collar to pelvis, fused flesh and black carapace mingling where his secondary heart had been punctured. "Can you restore him?" asked one of the butcher thralls. Nerez looked at the warrior. The Chaos Marine's helm was gone. His face had been eaten down to the jaw on one side, exposing teeth and the flecks of tendons. His remaining eye burned with hatred. "No," Nerez said, "but I can learn from him." The wounded legionary tried to laugh. It came out as a wet rasp. "Cut deep, butcher," he whispered. "Leave nothing for the bugs." Nerez inclined his helm. A worthy request. He opened the warrior with a bone saw and began harvesting what remained worth preserving. Far above, in the cathedral strategium, Varric Threx watched the hololithic death of Gorak Tertius replay again and again. The chamber had once been an imperial shrine, built in an age when Varos still knelt to terror. Its walls had been formed from ranks of saint statues, each carved with serene faces and uplifted hands. The Ashen Maw had not torn them down. That would have been too merciful. Instead, the Warband had defaced them. Horns had been bolted through marble brows. Aquilus had been gouged away and replaced with the 8-pointed star. Demon script crawled over stone robes. Some statues had mortal skin nailed across their faces. Others wept oil from hollowed eyes. The strategium table stood in the nave, a slab of black crystal veined with trapped lightning. Around it, the champions of the Ashen Maw gathered like carrion kings around a corpse. Varric stood at the head, helm locked beneath one arm, his pale face unreadable. Dried Tyranid ichor darkened the edges of his gauntlets. Behind him hung the Warband's trophies, Banners taken from loyalist chapters, regimental standards soaked in old blood, skulls of imperial commanders, Zeno's bones, the broken helms of rival traitors. They had filled the hall for centuries. They looked smaller now. Dragon Mole was first to speak, because Dragon Mole had never mistaken rage for strategy. "Gorak Tertius is lost," the warsmith said. His voice scraped from his helm grill like a blade drawn through rust. "The outer moon is no longer defensible, recoverable, or useful. Its remaining mass is being rendered into organic slurry and drawn into the bioships above it. We cannot contest that moon without wasting fleet strength we will require here." Korvac's red hand slammed his chain axe into the floor hard enough to split the stone. "Waste," he snarled. "You name slaughter waste because your iron guts have forgotten glory." Dragon's red optics turned toward him. "I name dead ammunition, lost ships and broken warriors waste because I can still count. Count skulls then. Count the dead things piled beneath my axe. I counted them. I also counted how much ground they gave you. None." A growl passed through the chamber. Several warriors shifted. Claws flexed. Weapon spirits awakened in their housings, hungry for fratricide. Korvac stepped forward, his crimson armor still slick with alien ichor and human blood. His helm hung from his belt, showing a face butchered by old scars and ritual brands. Brass nails studded his skull. His eyes were fever bright. "They are meat with claws," he said. "No more. They die when cut. They burst when shot. They scream inside when the axe finds them, whether they have throats for it or not. Give me every dropcraft, every assault claw, every brother with blood still in his veins. I will take the fight to the swarm before it reaches Varos. I will drown the void in their ichor." Dragon gave a sound that might have been contempt or machine static. "You will die in transit. Coward." The word cracked through the strategium. Dragon's servo arms unfolded over his shoulders, each tipped with saw, drill, and plasma torch. "Say it again, Red Hand, and I will demonstrate the difference between courage and functional armor." Korvac smiled with all his teeth. "Coward." Varrock lifted one hand. The chamber stilled, not from peace, from obedience. "We will not spill brother blood while Xenos claws scratch at our gates," the Chaos Lord said. "Then command us," Korvac said. "Not with maps, with war." Dragon pointed one iron finger at the hololith. Varos appeared above the table, ringed by its fortress hives, orbital platforms, minefields, and broken moons. "War requires denial. We seed the outer approaches with atomic mines and gravitic snares. We burn every dead zone that can feed them. We empty the lowland slave pits and drive the stock into the fortress hives, where they can serve as labor, shield mass, and emergency ration flesh. We cripple the outlying refineries before the swarm reaches them. We abandon what cannot be held. We retreat in controlled sequence to Black Furnace Hive, Iron Sepulchre Hive, and the Basilica Perimeter. You would surrender the world piece by piece," Korvac said. "I would prevent the world from being eaten whole in a single bite." Malachor Vare stood apart from them, half hidden beneath the shadow of a saint, whose marble hands had been replaced with hooked talons. The sorcerer's face was gaunt, his eyes bruised black by the force that had pressed against his mind. Parchment charms covered in ward script fluttered around his armor despite the still air. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the chamber leaned toward it. "The warsmith is correct, though not correct enough." Korvac spat on the floor. "Another prophecy, another witch riddle. No riddle, truth." Malachor's eyes moved to Varrock. "The enemy cannot be ruled by terror. It cannot be bribed by flesh in any way that matters. It cannot be tempted by dominion, glory, power, sensation, revenge, or worship. The hive mind is not a demon prince brooding in the warp. It is not a rival warlord. It is not a court of gods. It is a psychic presence vast enough to press against the immaterium and drown lesser signals by existing." Varrock's expression did not change. "Everything that thinks can be deceived. It thinks as a storm thinks, as a plague thinks, as starvation thinks. It does not bargain because it wants nothing we understand as desire. It cannot be terrified because fear would require the self to matter. It cannot be corrupted by promises because it has no ambition beyond continuation and consumption. Nerez entered as Malachor finished speaking, his armor still wet from the quarantine decks. One of his servo claws carried a sealed glass reliquary. Inside it, a fist-sized feeder organism thrashed against restraint wires, blind mouth opening and closing. Its pale body had darkened in patches, veins of black spreading through its flesh, where Nerez had injected warp-reactive toxins. Not corrupted, the apothecary said, but influenced. Dregan turned his helm. You are late. I was dissecting evidence while you argued over cowardice and poetry. Korvax chuckled. Careful, Butcher. Dregan has grown sensitive. Nerez placed the reliquary on the table. The organism inside slammed itself against the glass until its skin split. The wound closed almost immediately. I have tested toxin strains, demon engine runoff, sacrificial ash, liquefied mutant tissue, and warp-charged humors drawn from the lower reliquaries. Their lesser organisms die, then adapt. Some resist, some redirect, some enter violent growth collapse, but all respond. Malachor looked at the twitching thing with open disgust. You propose plaguecraft. I propose weaponized mutation. Nerez tapped the glass. Tyranid biology is not holy. It is flesh. Flesh lies. Flesh fails. Flesh can be made to betray itself. Give me the plague vaults and the old mutagen caskets beneath the apothecarian. Give me prisoners. Give me living. Samples. Give me time, and I will turn their appetite against them. Dregan's answer was immediate. No. Nerez tilted his helm. No. No uncontrolled contagions within the primary fortress network, while an adaptive Xenos swarm approaches. Your caution begins to resemble terror, Warsmith. My caution resembles mathematics. Your proposal resembles vanity with surgical tools. Korvax laughed again. Let him try. If his plague fails, I will kill the things it makes. Malachor shook his head. You all still imagine the enemy as an army. It is not. It is an ending with organs. Varric listened to them in silence. This was the sound of his warband as it truly was. Not united, never united. Bound by fear, old oaths, shared crimes, and the usefulness of each other's blades. Korvax wanted glory, because glory was the only language his rage still understood. Dregan wanted survival, because survival allowed revenge to continue. Nerez wanted knowledge because flesh was his scripture. Malachor wanted escape, though he hid it behind warnings and prophecy. Others in the chamber wanted their own paths. Captains whispered behind helms. Champions measured the exits. Lesser lords already wondered which ships might flee before the swarm reached orbit. Varric felt their fracture like cracks beneath his boots. He would have killed one of them to restore unity if any single death would have sufficed. Instead, the floor screamed. The sound came from below the strategium, deep beneath the black crystal table, beneath the nave stones, beneath the chained vaults where the warband kept its oldest dead. The first bellow shook dust from the defaced saints. The second split the hololith into static. The third made mortal attendants fall to their knees with blood running from their ears. Chains groaned beneath the chamber. Something vast moved in the dark below. A dreadnought sarcophagus, ancient and possessed, bound in a pit of iron and warded stone, dragged itself awake after decades of drugged silence. Its name was Garl the Entombed. Once, perhaps, it had been a warrior. Now it was a prison of adamantium and madness, a walking coffin inhabited by a half-dead legionary and the demon that had spent centuries chewing on his soul. The Voxhorn screamed with his voice. It dreams without the warp. The strategium trembled. Malachor went rigid. Garl's voice came again, layered with machine thunder and demonic hatred. I heard it in the black between slaughters. I heard it pressing, not clawing from below, not whispering from beyond, pressing, pressing, pressing against my dreams. Varrock looked down at the floor, as if he could see through stone and iron to the chained monster beneath. "What did you see, Old One?" The answer was a howl that became words only by violence. "Teeth enough to eat gods, hunger enough to shame the dark. It does not know my name, it does not know yours, it does not know hatred. I hate it for that." The dreadnought hammered against its chains. Far below, restraint anchors shrieked. "Let me walk." Korvax smiled. "A sound request." "Let him rot," Dragon said. "The sarcophagus is unstable." "I said let me walk," Garl thundered, the vox blowing out half the mortal speakers in the chamber. "Let me kill until my bones forget they are dead." Varrock raised his hand again, though the gesture was slower this time. "Soon," he said. The dreadnought's laughter rolled away into the dark beneath them, not fading so much as sinking. Varrock turned back to the gathered champions. The chamber smelled of hot stone, blood, ozone, and fear. Good. Fear was useful when chained to purpose. "You speak of retreat," he said to Dragon. "You speak of plague," he said to Neres. "You speak of omens," he said to Malachor. "You speak of glory," he said to Korvax. "All of you speak as though Varos is a battlefield to be traded." He stepped closer to the hololithic world. "This world is mine." No one answered. "My gene vaults lie beneath this basilica. My demon engines are chained in these foundries. My armories, my shipyards, my slave millions, my trophies, my dead, my victories, my sins, all are here. I did not carve Varos from the corpse of the Imperium so that a mindless hunger could drink it while I fled into the void like a beaten corsair." Malachor's voice was low. "Pride has killed. Greater lords than you." Varrock looked at him. The sorcerer bowed his head just enough to live. "Then let pride kill beautifully," Varrock said. He placed his helm upon his head, the tusked furnace mouth sealed over his face. When he spoke again, his voice came through the vox grill as a deeper, crueler thing. "Dragon, prepare orbital denial and fortress withdrawal, but no ship leaves this world without my command. Any captain attempting flight will be destroyed by our own guns." The warsmith inclined his helm. "It will be done. Neres, open the plague vaults under my seal. You will have prisoners, samples, and flesh. If your creations threaten the inner hives before they threaten the swarm, I will feed you to them in strips." "Understood, Lord." "Korvax, gather your berserkers and assault claws. You will have your counterstroke when I command it, not before." Korvax's chain axe purred. "My patience is thin." "Then sharpen it on prayer." Korvax laughed at that, a bark of savage approval. "Malachor." The sorcerer looked up. "You will summon aid." The chamber changed. Even Dragon went still. Malachor's lips parted. "The shadow in the warp will strangle any delicate rite." "Then do not be delicate. The cost will be immense." Varrock turned, surveying the mortal attendants, the chained scribes, the slave officers, the vox thralls, and the frightened human machinery of his domain. "Varos has bodies." Malachor's expression darkened. "How many?" Varrock looked back to the hololith, where the dead moon continued to shrink beneath pale capillary growths and feeding bioships. 1 million, he said. The words fell like an execution bell. 1 million slaves taken from the equatorial pits. Open the amphitheaters. Raise the brass icons. Bleed them in circles large enough for the gods to see through the storm. If the hive mind presses upon the warp, we will answer with a wound so deep that demons smell it from the eye. Malachor stared at him for a long moment. And if the gods do not answer? Varrock's helm turned toward him, tusks black with old blood. Then we will give them another 1 million. The slave amphitheaters of Varos opened like wounds across the equatorial pits. They had been built for spectacle in the 1st century of Varrock Threx's rule, when the Ashen Moor had still cared to make examples slowly. Each amphitheater was a sunken bowl of black iron, brass, and heat-cracked stone, large enough to hold entire Hab districts in chains. They ringed the foundry plains in a broken crown, their outer walls carved with the names of dead imperial commanders, butchered saints, rival warlords, failed champions, and slaves who had amused their masters by resisting longer than expected. Now, every gate was open. Mortals were driven into the killing circles by shock whips, gun servitors, mutant wardens, and chain-masked overseers. They came in rivers of skin and bone, millions taken from the pits and manufacturing pens, dragged from ore lines, furnace gangs, corpse farms, penal barracks and breeding cages. Some still wore work harnesses. Some were naked beneath the ash rain. Some clutched the hands of brothers or sons until the whips cut them apart. Some prayed to the emperor in whispers. Others screamed praises to the ruinous powers with cracked lips because they believed devotion might make their deaths meaningful. None were spared. The brass icons had already been raised. They towered above the amphitheaters on chains thick as void ship anchor cables. 8-pointed stars turned slowly in the hot wind. Brazen skulls with open mouths drank the smoke from corpse braziers. Banners of burned skin snapped from iron poles, each one painted with demonic script that hurt mortal eyes. The words crawled when the slaves tried not to look at them. They promised ascension, damnation, ecstasy, agony, truth, lies, eternity, and nothing at all. Above, the sky blackened. At first, it was taken for smoke from the manufactorums. Varos had always hidden beneath its own poisoned breath. Then the clouds moved against the wind. They thickened in patches, bulging downward as if something pressed through them from above. Mycetic spores fell in the far distance, glimmering like rotten stars through the haze. Some burst in the upper atmosphere. Others descended intact, slow and swollen, shedding trails of toxic dust. The Tyranids had reached Varos. Varrock Threx stood upon the central altar of the greatest amphitheater, beneath the largest brass icon, surrounded by his champions. His warplate had been polished with blood until its burned bone plates shone darkly in the furnace light. His tusked helm hid his face. His cloak of preserved faces stirred behind him, the dead features weeping black tears in the presence of so much terror. Around his throne platform stood the Ashen Maw, ranks of Chaos Space Marines in scorched armor, weapons locked to mag clamps, helms turned toward the sacrifice. Behind them, on higher terraces, demon engines growled within restraining chains, their furnace hearts hungry for release. Varrock raised his gauntlet. The amphitheater fell silent by degrees. First the overseers stopped shouting, then the servitors ceased their warning bursts, then even the slaves quieted, though their fear remained, breathing through them in one vast animal sound. Malachor Vare knelt at the altar's edge, his armor covered in fresh scripture. His gauntlets were sunk wrist-deep into a basin of blood drawn from the first 100 sacrifices. Around him stood the Warband's priests and apostles, figures wrapped in flayed hides and brass chains, their faces hidden behind iron masks shaped into snarling demons. They chanted in the dark tongue. The syllables scraped through the amphitheater like hooks dragged over bone. Mutants beat drums made from stretched human skin. Cult priests swung censers filled with powdered skull and narcotic incense. Apostles cut open their own palms and painted runes across their chests. The slaves began to moan. Varrock's voice rolled from the vox horns mounted around the killing circles. Gods of the deep warp, witness your sons, witness the blood owed to you, witness the world that bears its throat in your names. At the edge of the circles, the first killing crews moved. They were not warriors, not truly. They were execution thralls bred for endurance, their arms swollen with vat muscle, their faces stapled behind iron plates. Each carried a cleaver, hook, saw, spear, or chain blade. At the signal, they entered the packed bodies and began their work. The amphitheater became a machine for death. Men were opened in long red lines. Throats were cut so quickly that blood ran across the stone in sheets. Heads fell into gutters carved for that purpose. Limbs were hacked away and thrown into braziers. Some slaves were hung from hooks and split from sternum to groin, their organs spilling into ritual troughs while they still kicked. Others were forced to watch brothers die before being driven forward themselves. The killing circles filled ankle-deep, then shin-deep, with blood. The chant grew louder. The sky grew darker. Malachor threw his head back and opened his soul. The warp answered. Reality did not tear cleanly. It blistered. It bulged over the amphitheater as if the air had become diseased skin. Red light leaked from cracks that had no shape. Voices came first, laughing, shrieking, promising slaughter. Then claws pressed through. Horned heads followed. Blades of brass and bone thrust into the world, steaming with impossible heat. Bloodletters clawed their way into being, red-skinned and hateful, their hell blades hissing as they touched mortal air. Warp things followed them, malformed predators with too many mouths and limbs that changed length with every twitch. Demonic hounds bounded from the wounds in space, their jaws trailing fire. Lesser spirits rode the bloodsteam, taking shapes for a heartbeat before losing them and becoming new horrors. The slaves screamed louder. The demons screamed louder still. Varos spread his arms, triumphant. "Feast," he commanded. "Tear the Xenos from my sky." For a moment, it seemed the ritual had succeeded. Bloodletters charged from the amphitheater and into the outer killing fields, where the first Tyranid organisms had already landed. They moved with supernatural speed, hellblades cutting through gaunts in burning arcs. Hormagaunts burst apart beneath demonic strength. Gargoyles were dragged from the air by leaping warphounds and ripped open in showers of ichor. The malformed predators plunged into spore mists, emerging with talons full of chitin and twitching alien organs. Korvac's red hand howled his approval. The cornate champion vaulted from the terrace, chain axe roaring to life before his boots struck the soaked stone. His berserkers followed, red armor crashing through the ranks of execution thralls and dying slaves. They did not care who stood before them. Mortals were crushed beneath ceramite boots, cut apart by accidental blows, flung screaming into the blood gutters. Korvax reached the outer field at a run, laughing through his vox grill as Tyranid gaunts broke against him. "This is worship," he roared. "This is the only prayer that matters." His chain axe found a Hormagaunt's neck and removed its head in a spray of purple-black fluid. His bolt pistol fired into another, the shell detonating in its chest and painting his armor with fragments of lung and shell. A bloodletter beside him shrieked and severed 3 more beasts with a single sweep of its hellblade. Korvax laughed harder. Then the pressure came. Malachor felt it before any of them. The shadow in the warp descended upon the ritual like an ocean falling from the sky. It did not attack as a demon attacked. It did not claw, whisper, or tempt. It pressed against every opened wound in reality, smothering the rites, choking the connection, grinding prophecy and sorcery beneath an intellect too vast to hate them. Malachor's chant broke. Blood burst from his nose, then from his ears, then from the corners of his eyes. His secondary sight filled with black water and teeth. He tried to speak the binding verses, but every syllable collapsed in his throat. The apostles around him faltered. One vomited blood until his lungs came out in red ropes. Another's eyes turned white and boiled in their sockets. A priest beat his skull against the altar, screaming that the gods had gone silent. The warp wounds flickered. A bloodletter halfway into reality was cut in half as the tear sealed around it. Its upper body fell screaming onto the altar stones, clawing forward until its substance dissolved into hot red vapor. Demonic hounds blurred, losing definition, snapping at nothing as their forms thinned. The malformed predators convulsed, as if invisible chains had tightened around their souls. Varrock turned toward Malachor. "Hold the gate." The sorcerer looked up, blood running from every opening in his face. "I cannot," he gasped. Varroc's gauntlet closed around the hilt of his blade. Malachor forced his hands deeper into the blood basin and screamed the words again. The ritual flared. The wounds widened for another handful of breaths. More demons poured through, but fewer than promised, fewer than needed, fewer than pride had demanded. The Tyranids adapted without knowing the word. The gaunts did not recoil from the demons. They attacked them as they attacked all threats, by weight, fang, and synapse-driven coordination. Lesser demons cut down dozens, then hundreds, only to vanish beneath the bodies of those that followed. Warp flesh that should have terrified mortals was treated as meat in motion. Claws tore it, teeth locked into it, acid splashed across it. The swarm did not understand blasphemy. It did not comprehend sanctity. A demon was simply an obstacle with energy inside it. Synapse beasts emerged through the spore fog. Tyranid warriors strode between the lesser broods, their blade limbs raised, their presence sharpening the chaos into purpose. Gargoyles stopped scattering and began striking the demonic hounds from above, dragging them down under clusters of biting bodies. Termagants poured living ammunition into bloodletters until the demons staggered under impacts that ruptured their forms. Larger shapes moved behind the smoke. Carnifexes came like walking battering rams, crushing execution pens and brass altars beneath their hooves. The demons fought with hate. The Tyranids fought with direction. That was the difference, and it widened with every passing moment. Korvax saw it while buried waist-deep in death. A demonic hound beside him vanished under rippers. It killed until it disappeared, biting and burning, but the little organisms stripped it apart in layers until warp stuff bled into the mud. A bloodletter was dragged down by gaunts that impaled themselves on its blade just to pin the weapon in place, allowing others to climb its limbs and tear into its throat. A carnifex smashed through a knot of malformed warp predators, ignoring wounds that smoked with demonic fire, until its massive crushing claws closed around one and pulped it into a flash of dissolving unreality. Korvax split a warrior across the sternum and drove his chain axe deep into its thorax. It died, twitching. Two more stepped through the spray. His laughter faltered, not from fear. The Red Hand did not know enough of himself to fear death as mortals did. It faltered because there was no audience in the enemy. No hatred answered him. No rival champion bellowed his name. No worthy skull was offered by prideful hands. The Tyranids gave no insult and recognized no glory. They did not meet his wrath with wrath. They spent bodies as mindlessly as the Ashen Moor spent slaves, but with purer purpose and endless supply. The battlefield was becoming a slaughterhouse with no honor, no witness, and no victory. "Come on," Korvax growled, as if the swarm could understand him. "Know me!" A Hormagaunt leapt for his throat. He smashed it apart with his fist. "Know me!" More came. Within the amphitheater, Nerez Halvek watched the ritual fail with a fascination so intense it bordered on reverence. He stood behind a barricade of dead slaves, lenses recording every interaction. Feeder beasts had reached the inner circles now. Rippers slid through the blood gutters, stopping to consume flesh from the dead and dying alike. They fed on cultists first, then mutants, then the corpses of priests whose bodies were soaked in warp oils and sacrificial ink. Some spasmed and died after consuming tainted flesh. Others bloated, burst, and were devoured by their kin. A few continued. Nerez marked them. He saw one feeder organism consume part of a demon host corpse, convulse, and grow a ridge of blackened chitin along its spine before tearing into another body. He saw another spit out warp-tainted meat and seek untainted flesh instead. He saw gaunts avoid patches of reality still burning with raw immaterium, while other broods were driven straight through them under synapse compulsion, dying in order to test the hazard. "They are not immune," he murmured. "They are selective." A butcher thrall beside him was staring at the approaching rippers. "Lord, they are inside the circle." "Yes," Nerez said. "Remain still." The thrall did not. He turned to run. A lictor dropped from the broken icon above him. It had been there for several minutes, perhaps longer, hidden in plain sight against brass and shadow. Its mantis limbs unfolded with obscene grace. One talon pierced the thrall through the spine and lifted him screaming into the air. Feeder tendrils found his face. His screams became wet bubbling as his skull emptied through his mouth. Neres raised his plasma pistol and fired. The shot blew the lictor's shoulder apart in a burst of superheated ichor. It vanished into the smoke before he could fire again, leaving the thrall behind as a twitching skin sack. Neres watched the wound it had left in the air. Infiltration organisms, he recorded. Advanced concealment, cranial extraction, prioritize command assets, and isolated prey. A ripper climbed his boot. He crushed it beneath his heel and felt the acid eat at his ceramite. Also insolent. The ritual site collapsed by stages. First, the outer circles were overrun. Then the slave pens ruptured as panicked mortals surged against their chains. They trampled each other, trying to escape the descending gargoyles and the rising tide of feeder organisms. Overseers fired until buried. Gun servitors tracked and killed targets until rippers crawled into their ammunition feeds. Brass icons toppled as carnifexes struck their anchor chains, crushing hundreds of slaves beneath falling metal. The blood basins overflowed. The warp wounds dimmed. Malachor remained kneeling, unable to stand, his armor painted in his own blood. The apostles were dead or mad around him. One still chanted, though his tongue lay on the floor before him, and his jaw hung by strips of flesh. Another had become a portal for something that could not fully manifest, his abdomen swollen with impossible light before the shadow crushed it and left him hollow. Varrock stood upon the altar as the amphitheater drowned. He had expected demonic reinforcement. He had expected the gods to answer the largest bloodletting in the Warband's history with a storm of claws, brass, and fire. He had expected his offering to matter. Below him, a bloodletter vanished beneath a carpet of gaunts. Above him, mycetic spores fell thicker than ash. Around him, 1,000,000 deaths became mud. The Chaos Lord raised his blade and pointed it toward the sky. "All things bleed," he snarled. The sky answered. A spore pod larger than a fortress tower punched through the smoke and struck the heart of the ruined amphitheater. The impact flattened the altar steps, burst the blood gutters, and hurled bodies outward in a ring of red mist. Stone cracked. Brass icons screamed as they bent. Demons near the impact flickered and vanished. Slaves, cultists, mutants, and gaunts alike were reduced to paste beneath the pressure wave. For a moment, even the swarm seemed still. The pod split open. Steam poured from within, thick with the smell of hot blood and alien birth fluids. Massive claws gripped the edges of the rupture. A towering shape emerged, armored in layered chitin, its head crowned with blades and sensory spines, its eyes black with synaptic command. It carried no banner. It needed none. Every lesser beast within sight altered at once. The Hive Tyrant stepped into the crater. Around it came Tyrant Guard, hulking and shield-limbed, their bodies built to intercept death itself. They formed around their master like living bastions. The tyrant raised its head, and though it made no speech, the battlefield heard it in the only language the swarm required. The gaunts stopped milling. The gargoyles turned as one. The warriors shifted formation. The rippers poured away from spent corpses and toward living resistance. Millions of organisms snapped into terrible order. Varrock Threx stood amid blood, ichor, bone, and failed prophecy, staring across the crater at the first true herald of the hive mind. The hive tyrant stared back without hatred. That was worse. Black Furnace Hive did not rise from the plains of Varos. It conquered them. Its walls stretched beyond the horizon in both directions, continent-wide bulwarks of black adamantium, basalt, corpse mortar, and furnace slag. Its manufactorum stacks stabbed upward through the ash clouds, vomiting smoke so thick that daylight entered the hive only as a red smear through poison haze. Entire cities could have drowned in its lower smelting ducts. Armored regiments could have vanished inside its ammunition vaults and never crossed the same corridor twice. It was fortress, factory, prison, shrine and tomb, all fused into one immense engine of war. Around it, the land had been murdered into usefulness. Minefields quilted the ash wastes. Tank traps formed jagged black teeth before the outer bastions. Macro flak walls ringed the hive in layered tiers, their guns elevated toward a sky already rotten with spores. Between the walls stood demon engines chained in restraint pits, brass-bound monstrosities pouring at the ground with iron claws, their furnace hearts beating behind rib cages of riveted steel. Heretic armor columns waited in the access trenches, predators and vindicators marked with ash sigils, their crews sealed inside by oath, fear and weld marks. Millions of slave soldiers packed the defense lines, shoulder to shoulder, Lazarifles and autoguns clutched in shaking hands, collars locked around their throats. Dragon Mole stood at the central command altar and made the hive into a weapon. The warsmith's helm fed him 1,000 tactical overlays at once. Ammunition levels blinked in red runes. Shield harmonics pulsed across his left lens. Vox discipline markers flickered and died as mortal officers panicked, were corrected, or were replaced by servitors. He had no patience for speeches. Pride did not hold walls. Faith did not reload guns. Hatred was useful only when given firing arcs. "Flood the eastern habways with promethium," he ordered. "Seal the southern manufactorum gates after the penal cohorts pass through. If they do not pass quickly enough, seal them anyway." A mortal command thrall hesitated. "Lord, there are still work gangs inside." Dragon turned one red optic toward him. The thrall corrected himself before the warsmith needed to move. "Sealing southern manufactorum gates. Convert streets 9 through 18 into kill corridors. Remove civilian obstructions." Another thrall bent over the controls. "By civilian obstructions, Lord, do you mean the chained reserves?" "I mean anything that obstructs fire." The order moved through the hive like a blade. Blast doors groaned shut. Manufactorum avenues narrowed as barricades slammed upward from beneath the roadways. Promethium pipes were cut, redirected, pressurized and blessed by screaming machine. Priests, whose mechadendrites shook with terror. Streets that had once carried ore caravans and slave processions became metal throats ready to drown attackers in flame. Gun nests unfolded from chapel walls. Murder holes opened in hab towers. Servo skulls buzzed through the smog, bearing Dragon's commands from bastion to bastion. Black Furnace Hive waited. The Tyranids arrived without drums, banners, or challenge. The sky fell first. Mycetic spores plunged through the ash clouds in swarms so vast they blotted out the red star. Macro flak batteries opened before they breached the lower atmosphere. The hive shook under the recoil. Thousands of guns thundered in layered sequence, each discharge slamming into the next until the world became noise. Shells burst among the descending spores, turning the sky into a pulped storm of burning flesh, shredded membrane, and alien ichor. Spores ruptured overhead, spilling half-formed beasts that fell screaming without voices and burst across the outer minefields. The ground shook next. Tyranid broods came through the ash wastes in endless tides. Hormagaunts bounded over dead ground, talons held wide, bodies low and hungry. Termagants came behind them, flesh borers pulsing in their limbs. Larger shapes moved among them like siege towers made of shell and muscle. Carnifexes lowered their horned heads and charged the walls through mine blasts that took legs, eyes, and chunks of carapace, but did not stop them. Dragon watched the approach with the cold satisfaction of a craftsman seeing theory meet material. "Fire," Black Furnace Hive spoke. Macro cannons on the outer wall spat shells the size of hab rooms into the swarm. The first salvos vaporized entire waves, leaving craters filled with purple vapor and twitching fragments. Mining lasers cut white-hot lanes through the gaunts, splitting thousands into smoking halves. Heavy bolters hammered from every bastion, each bolt shell detonating inside alien bodies with wet, percussive bursts. The ash wastes vanished under overlapping fields of fire. Slave soldiers cheered until their overseers beat them silent. The demon engines were released when the first Carnifex brood reached the tank traps. Chains blew apart. Brass gates opened. The engines went mad into the swarm. One crawled on 8 piston limbs, its front half shaped like a siege ram, and its rear a furnace of caged souls. It smashed into a Carnifex with enough force to crack both their bodies. The demon engine's maw opened and filled with rotating saws, dragging the beast inward by the face. Chitin screamed against metal. Ichor sprayed in arterial jets across the minefield. Another engine, taller than a hab block, fired a torrent of warp flame that washed over gaunts and turned them into shrieking silhouettes of boiling meat. The opening siege was magnificent. Dragon allowed himself the smallest measure of approval. The outer approaches became slaughter plains. Tyranid dead piled high before the walls. The living climbed over them and died in turn. Heretic armor columns rolled from sally ports, firing into the flanks of the swarm before withdrawing behind armored gates. Havoc squads on the parapets reaped the sky with autocannons. Raptors dropped from smoke banks onto clusters of warriors, butchered them with lightning claws, and leapt away before the lesser broods could engulf them. Every breach attempt was met with more death. A Carnifex reached the northern gate and began battering it with crushing claws. A squad of Chaos Marines descended from the wall on mag chains, landed upon its back, and drove chain blades into its spine until it collapsed under them. One warrior rammed a melter gun into its eye socket and fired. The beast's head erupted from within, showering the gate in steaming brains and shell fragments. The Chaos Marines raised their weapons and roared through their vox grills. The swarm came on. By the time the ash wastes had become a continent of twitching dead, the first change began. Dragon saw it in the pattern before any mortal reported it. The attacks stopped flowing straight into the strongest kill zones. Gaunt waves bent away from streets drowned in artillery fire. Gargoyle flocks climbed higher, then dropped behind the flak arcs where the guns could not depress quickly enough. Burrowing signatures flickered beneath the eastern wall, faint at first, then multiplying. Lictor contacts appeared and vanished inside command. Sectors that should have been sealed. Zoanthropes drifted through the smoke beyond the shield curtain, their swollen skulls pulsing with pale psychic force. "Adaptation phase," Dragon said. No one near him answered. Most of the mortal officers were too afraid to understand. "Redirect reserve batteries to subsurface tracks. Burn the lower tunnels. Kill anything that emerges within the second ring, including our own." Scepter Voss received that order in the slave command bunker beneath Bastion Carth Secundus. He had survived Gorak Tertius by clinging to a departing assault craft with one hand while the moon cracked behind him. His obedience collar still bore scorch marks from Varroc's displeasure at his retreat. Now he stood among sweating officers, penal captains and vox thralls, his red augmetic eye twitching as reports drowned the chamber. "Eastern trench gone. Slave cohort 9 refuses advance. Gargoyles inside the ration towers. Shield fluctuation at the upper spine. Something has severed the command line to gun nest Tarsus." Voss looked across the bunker. "Where is Captain Harl?" No one answered. The captain had been standing beside the tactical lectern moments before. Now his boots remained there, upright, with his feet still inside them. The rest of him was gone. A trail of blood led up the wall and across the ceiling. The lumen strips flickered. Voss drew his pistol. "Seal the doors." A Vox officer turned toward the controls, then stopped. Something thin and wet slid from his mouth. His eyes widened in confusion. His head tilted sideways, then came free from his neck, as if cut by invisible wire. His body remained seated for 2 heartbeats before collapsing over the console. No alarm sounded. The lictor moved through the bunker without being seen whole. A shimmer against iron, a scrape above the vents, a hooked talon passing through smoke. Men died in pieces. One officer was pinned to a map board through both lungs, his blood running down over the marked defense lines. Another was found folded backward into an ammunition locker, spine snapped and face removed. The beast did not merely kill, it arranged. Bodies were placed against doors, across cables, over controls, each death turning the bunker into a puzzle of severed command. Voss backed into the vox pit, pistol raised. He heard breathing that was not human. "Show yourself," he whispered, and hated himself for whispering. The answer was the wet click of feeder tendrils. A penal captain fired blindly into the ceiling. The lictor dropped behind him, mantis talons unfolding. Voss saw it then, tall, hunched, chameleonic flesh rippling with bunker shadows, its face a horror of tendrils and black eyes. It pierced the captain through the skull and lifted him from the ground. The man kicked once, twice. Then the feeder tendrils entered his ruined face, and his thoughts spilled out with his blood. Voss fired. His round struck nothing. The lictor had already moved. In the lower manufactorum, subtlety died. Korvac's red hand led the countercharge through the molten gut of Black Furnace Hive, where promethium pipes ran along the walls and conveyor chains dragged ore cauldrons overhead. The Tyranids had breached through waste vents and corpse chutes, pouring into the lower districts in a living flood. Hormagaunts bounded over machinery. Rippers boiled from drainage trenches. Warriors stalked through steam, their blades scraping sparks from the floor. Korvax met them with berserkers at his back. There were no firing lines in the lower manufactorum, no clean fields of artillery, only corridors too narrow for retreat and too crowded for mercy. Chain axes screamed, talons scraped, bodies slammed into bodies until the passageways became pressurized with meat. Korvax took a Hormagaunt's head in his fist and crushed it until ichor burst between his fingers. He swung his axe one-handed, cutting 3 more apart in a single sweep. A warrior drove a blade into his pauldron, shearing through brass and ceramite. Korvax head-butted it hard enough to crack its faceplate, then shoved the chain axe into its abdomen and lifted upward. The weapon chewed through organs and spine, throwing ropes of alien viscera across the walls. Around him, berserkers and gaunts reduced each other to ruin. A Chaos Marine slipped on the entrails of a mutant slave and went down beneath leaping Hormagaunts. He killed 4 before they opened his throat seal. His last act was to detonate a crack grenade against his own chest, blowing himself and the swarm atop him into wet fragments. Another berserker lost an arm to Bonezords, picked up the severed limb by its wrist, and beat a gaunt to death with his own still twitching gauntlet before a Carnifex's charge smeared him across a furnace wall. The corridor floor vanished beneath meat paste, chitin shards and broken chain blades. Korvax laughed, but the sound came through grinding teeth. "More," he roared. "Send me more." The hive mind obliged. In the apothecarian annex behind the second wall, Nerez Halvek poisoned the enemy and watched the enemy learn. His test chambers had been moved closer to the front, despite Dregan's objections. Captured organisms were dragged in by chain gangs and restraint servitors. Some arrived alive. Some arrived in parts that still tried to bite. Nerez injected warp mutagenic toxins into gaunts, smeared plague cultures across open carapace wounds, exposed feeder organisms to pulverized demon bone and sacrificial ash. Early results were promising. The first contaminated broods convulsed and died. The second attacked each other in blind frenzy. The third liquefied from within, spilling corrosive bile that consumed nearby organisms. Nerez recorded everything with mounting satisfaction. Then later waves stopped entering contaminated zones. Not all of them. Enough to matter. A gaunt brood reached a corridor where plague mist curled low over the floor. The first rank entered and died. The second slowed. The third climbed the walls and ceiling, avoiding the densest vapor. Rippers encountered corpse bait soaked in mutagen and ignored it, flowing instead toward living flesh. A warrior struck by toxins sealed the wound beneath a clotting layer of hardened tissue before the poison could spread. Neres stood behind armored glass and watched a feeder beast chew through a dead cultist deliberately left as bait. The corpse had been filled with warp-reactive plague. The feeder swallowed 3 mouthfuls, spasmed, and died. The organisms behind it did not continue. They passed around the corpse like water around a stone. Discrimination, Neres said. His assistant, a vat-grown thing with no jaw, wrote the word in trembling script. No instinctive gluttony in later broods, synaptic correction, local memory becoming swarm doctrine. Beyond the glass, the next wave avoided every marked hazard. Neres's fingers flexed. They are not merely bodies, they are a method. Far above, Malachor Vare tried to read the future from the highest shrine of Black Furnace Hive. The shrine had once contained an Imperial Saint's reliquary. Now it held a pit of ash, bone dust, and burnt astropath skulls. Malachor knelt before it, hands submerged to the wrist, chanting through cracked lips while the shadow in the warp pressed against his mind. The old ways resisted him. Every omen curdled. Every path he opened filled with hunger. He saw Varrock standing atop a mountain of skulls. Then the skulls dissolved into digestion slurry. He saw Korvax roaring beneath a brass sky. Then rippers poured from his mouth. He saw Dragon behind walls of iron, counting shells until the numbers became teeth. He saw Neres opening a perfect specimen, only to find his own organs arranged inside it. He saw Varos from orbit, stripped pale and dry. He saw no throne, no demon prince, no dark ascension, no apotheosis, no glorious last charge echoing through eternity. Only hunger, only digestion pools, only silence after the last scream had been rendered into biomass. Malachor pulled his hands from the ash. His palms were covered in tiny bite marks. In the central command altar, Dragon watched ammunition expenditure climb. That was the truth of the siege. Not the dead gaunts, not the shattered carnifexes, not the victories in the kill corridors. The truth was in the numbers. Shells fired, fuel spent, shield strain, wall stress, casualty ratios among slaves, then among legionaries. The swarm was not trying to win quickly. It was measuring him. Every attack had become a question. How far could the macro flak depress? How long could the shield hold against zoanthrope pressure? How fast could promethium channels be refilled? Which gates opened for counterattack? Which officers mattered? Which toxins killed? Which corridors led to reactors? Dragon's servo arms clicked in agitation. "It is forcing expenditure," he said. The mortal beside him did not understand. "Lord, it is buying knowledge with bodies." The eastern wall alarm began as a low tone. Then every rune on the command altar turned red. Beneath Black Furnace Hive, the ground opened. Trigons erupted from below the eastern wall in a storm of stone, metal, and screaming men. They came up like living drills, serpentine monsters plated in chitin, their bodies wreathed in bioelectric discharge. The first burst beneath a heretic tank column, lifting a predator into the air on its back before tearing through its hull. The tank detonated, spraying burning crew and armor fragments across the breach. The second surfaced under a slave regiment, swallowing hundreds into the collapsing earth. The third struck the wall foundations. The eastern wall folded inward, not all at once. That would have been merciful. It cracked, sagged, and then collapsed in sections large enough to bury districts. Macro cannons slid from their mounts and vanished into the dust. Flak towers toppled. Armored vehicles reversed, crashed into one another, and were dragged down as the ground became a mouth. Slaves fell screaming into the rupture by the thousands. Chaos Marines on the parapets tried to leap clear, but Raveners followed the Trigons upward, catching them with talons and pulling them into the dark. Dragon watched the breach widen. Through it came the swarm. For the first time since the siege began, Black Furnace Hive sounded less like a fortress and more like prey. Black Furnace Hive did not fall in a single thunderclap. It sickened. That was the horror of it. Fortresses were meant to break cleanly beneath siege guns, to split under orbital lance fire, to die in a blaze worthy of remembrance. Black Furnace Hive decayed while it still fought. Its guns still roared from the western bastions. Its shield pylons still spat blue fire into the storm. Its demon engines still thrashed in the streets and dragged Carnifex broods down beneath iron claws. Yet beneath all of that sound, beneath the artillery and the screams and the prayers to gods that answered only in hunger, the hive was being hollowed. Ammunition vaults ran dry by district, then by bastion, then by wall section. Munitions thralls dragged shell crates through corridors slick with blood and promethium foam, only to find the guns they served already silent, their crews reduced to torn uniforms and steaming bones. Fuel reservoirs bled into ruptured streets, where rippers drowned by the 1,000 and more came after them, drinking the poisoned sludge through mouths made to test what could be eaten. Slave reserves vanished into the furnace ways, fed forward by overseers, until there were no more chained bodies left to pack into the breach. The Ashen Moor had measured strength in brutality for centuries. Now, brutality was being measured against arithmetic. Dragon Mole stood before the central command altar, surrounded by red runes and failing reports. His servo arms worked without pause, one feeding data slates into a furnace-mouthed cogitator, another adjusting shield harmonics, another reloading the combi bolter locked to his left gauntlet. Beneath his helm, his jaw had clenched hard enough to crack one of his remaining teeth. "Eastern Magazine?" "Empty, Lord," said the Vox thrall. "Southern Reserve?" "Contaminated. Feeder organisms breached the seal." "Promethium floodlines?" "Pressure loss in 7 districts." Dragon turned one red optic toward him. The thrall's throat bobbed. "Pressure loss in the outer districts, Lord. Inner lines remain functional." "For how long?" The thrall looked down at the slate, as if numbers might become mercy if stared at long enough. "Less than an hour at current expenditure." Dragon absorbed the answer. He did not rage. Rage did not refill tanks. "Reduce burn intervals. Fire only when broods reach the secondary marks. Execute any officer who ignites early." The command passed outward. Somewhere, men would burn because they feared dying more than they feared him. Somewhere, other men would live several breaths longer because Dragon understood that every breath had to be bought. Varrock Threx chose those same hours to make examples. The retreating mortal commanders were brought before him in the western transit nave, a vaulted artery filled with marching slaves, ammunition, carts, wounded legionaries, and the smoke of nearby breach fires. They had pulled their cohorts back from a collapsing manufacturing block without permission. They had preserved several thousand penal soldiers, 2 gun tractors, and a handful of fuel haulers. It was, by mortal standards, a disciplined withdrawal. By Varrock's standard, it was theft. The commanders knelt in a row, stripped of helmets and command coats. Their faces were grey with exhaustion and powdered with ash. One had lost an ear. Another held his intestines in with both hands. They trembled beneath the gaze of the Chaos Lord, because they understood that no victory they had won mattered beside one order they had disobeyed. Varrock walked before them with his blade drawn. "You retreated." The first commander lifted his head. "Lord, the line was gone. We preserved fighting strength for the inner wall." Varrock stopped before him. "Did the wall thank you?" The commander blinked. "Lord, did the wall speak your name in gratitude? Did the guns sing praises because you fled toward them with living cowards?" The man said nothing. Varrock cut him from shoulder to groin. The blade's power field parted armor, meat and bone, in one incandescent stroke. The commander opened down the middle, and collapsed in wet halves across the nave floor. The others began begging. Varrock killed them one by one, some with the blade, some with his gauntlets. One he lifted by the skull and squeezed until the man's head burst between his fingers, spraying blood and brain matter across the boots of the watching slave officers. When the last corpse stopped kicking, Varrock turned to the warpsmith attendants waiting nearby. "Wire them into the gun nests." One of the attendants bowed, mechadendrites twitching. "They are dead, Lord." "Then they will not disobey again." The corpses were taken away, spines drilled, nerves stripped, skulls opened for crude conductor plugs. By the next firing cycle, the dead commanders hung inside servitor cradles along the western wall, their arms bolted to heavy stubbers, their jaws wired open around Vox pickups that made them scream whenever the guns fired. Their bodies jerked with every recoil. Their dead fingers pulled triggers until the ammunition belts ran dry. The slaves saw. The slaves understood. They fought harder for a while. Then the zoanthropes came closer. They drifted through the spore murk beyond the broken eastern wall, pale skulls swollen with impossible pressure, bodies dangling beneath them like afterthoughts. Around them moved lesser beasts in ordered patterns. Above them, gargoyles circled but did not strike. The air around the psychic organisms warped with heatless distortion. Bullets curved away. Shells detonated early. Men who looked directly at them tasted blood and childhood terror. Malachor Vare felt them before the outer bastions reported contact. He had sealed himself in the old astropathic choir chamber beneath the Basilica of Cinders, though nothing of the old choir remained except bone dust and blackened chairs. He had painted the walls with his own blood and the blood of executed psychers. Candles made from rendered slave fat guttered around him, their flames bending toward the east. Brass mirrors hung from chains and reflected not his face, but things that might have been futures if the universe still permitted prophecy.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
He knelt inside a circle of powdered skulls and begged the warp to answer, not as a supplicant. Malachor had not knelt in true worship for centuries. He begged as a drowning man begs air. He opened the old wounds in his soul, spoke the names of the powers that had whispered to him in the eye, offered secrets, offered sacrifices, offered the pain of others, and when that failed, the pain of himself. The warp stirred. Then the shadow pressed down. Malachor's body convulsed so hard, his armor joints shrieked. His head slammed against the stone floor. His tongue split between his teeth. He saw Varos as a skull, then as an egg, then as a lump of meat held beneath black water. He saw Varrock crowned in claws that were not his own. He saw Korvax laughing without a head. He saw Dragon counting shells inside a coffin, while rippers counted his bones from the outside. He saw Neres holding a beating heart that opened an eye and looked back at him. He tried to speak a warding phrase. The words came out as a stream of insects that were not insects. They dissolved into ash before they struck the floor. The shadow did not shout. It did not speak. It crushed. Malachor heard no language in it, only pressure, only appetite vast enough to make demonic malice seem intimate by comparison. The gods lied. Demons flattered, mocked, promised, seduced, tormented. This thing did none of that. It filled every direction until the sorcerer's own thoughts were trapped inside his skull, like prisoners in a sinking ship. He screamed until blood poured from his mouth. In the corpse fields below the eastern wall, Squad Krathos searched for the dead. They were 6 Chaos Space Marines from the Ashen Moor, veterans of raids against Imperial bastions, Orc empires, and rival traitor fleets. Their armor bore the scars of centuries. Their task was not glorious, but necessary. Recover the progenoid glands from fallen brothers before the swarm devoured them. Gene seed was legacy, currency, future, and memory. It could not be abandoned to Xenos hunger. They moved through a world of bodies. The breach fields were layered with corpses. Slave soldiers lay in drifts, stripped of faces and fingers by feeder organisms. Tyranid carcasses steamed under chemical rain. Broken tanks burned without crews. Here and there, ceramite limbs protruded from the heaps, marking where legionaries had fallen beneath the tide. Brother Sakor found the first. Here. The fallen warrior was half buried beneath gaunt remains. His helm was missing. His chest plate had been torn open, exposing the blackened cavity beneath. The squad apothecary knelt beside him and froze. "Gone," he said. "What?" "Both glands gone." Sakor looked down. The dead legionary's torso had been hollowed with obscene thoroughness, not harvested by an enemy surgeon. Eaten. The rib cage had been opened, organs stripped, reinforced bone gnawed clean. Tiny bite marks scored the inside of the spinal column. They found the second corpse in worse condition, then the third, then pieces of the fourth scattered across a trench, each piece stripped by rippers until even the gene seed was reduced to slurry and carried away in swollen feeder bellies. On the Vox, Sakor spoke to Varrock with a reluctance that tasted like death. "The glands are lost, Lord," Static breathed. Then Varrock answered, "Recover what remains. There is nothing useful. Recover what remains." Sakor looked at the carpet of moving feeder organisms gathering beyond the corpses. As commanded, the swarm found them before they found a single intact gland. In the apothecarian, Nerez Halvek watched a caged gaunt consume warp-tainted meat and refuse damnation. The sample had been prepared with care. Flesh from a demon host, blood from a possessed engine, mutagenic plague steeped in sacrificial oil. A lesser organism should have burst, transformed, or opened itself to possession. Instead, the gaunt ate, convulsed, excreted a blackened bile, and continued living. Its organs changed color. Its liver analogues swelled, hardened, and began filtering. Its flesh accepted the useful components and rejected the rest. Nerez leaned closer to the glass. "Not immunity," he said. "Selection, metabolism, partitioning." Behind him, a restrained feeder beast exposed to a stronger concentration spasmed itself apart. Another, bred from a later wave, consumed the same material and entered a dormant state, while acidic sacs within its gut separated warp-active tissue from usable biomass. Nerez watched in silence as the thing woke and began biting at the restraint hooks. The implications were not merely scientific. They were blasphemous in a way even he found offensive. Demonic corruption had weight. It had meaning. It ruined, exalted, remade, possessed, consumed. It was supposed to matter. Yet here was flesh that could touch the edge of damnation, digest what served it, and cast off what did not. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. "They can eat around the gods," he whispered. His jawless assistant scratched the phrase onto a slate. Nerez did not correct him. Korvax found Malachor crawling from the astropathic chamber like a broken insect. The sorcerer's armor was smeared with blood from helm to greave. His face was bare, eyes black and leaking, lips torn, breath hitching with aftershocks of psychic seizure. He dragged himself into the corridor, while distant artillery hammered dust from the ceiling. Korvax stood over him. "So this is the seer of the Ashen Maw." Malachor looked up, one eye struggling to focus. "Move." The Red Hand laughed. "I have seen slaves crawl with more dignity. The shadow is strengthening. Your weakness is strengthening." Korvax seized him by the throat and lifted him against the wall. The sorcerer's boots scraped stone. His fingers twitched toward a blade, but his strength was gone. "We bled 1,000,000 for your ritual," Korvax snarled. "We gave the gods a sea, and you brought us a puddle. Now you vomit prophecy and call it warning. Tell me which. Why should I not open you and see if your visions fall out?" Malachor smiled through bloody teeth. "Because you would not understand what you found." Korvax drew back his chain axe. Varrock's voice stopped him. "Put him down." The Chaos Lord stood at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 Terminators with combi bolters raised. His tusked helm turned slightly toward Korvax. The Red Hand did not release Malachor at once. He is spent. He is useful. He failed. So have the walls. I do not see you trying to murder them. Korvax's grip tightened. Malachor made a choking sound. Varrock walked closer. If you kill him, Red Hand, you will lead the next divination yourself. I will nail your skull open and pour the warp through it until something answers. Korvax stared at him. Then he dropped Malachor. The sorcerer hit the floor hard, coughing blood. Korvax stepped back, Chainax still growling. When this is done, I will have his skull. Varrock looked down at Malachor. When this is done, we will all be owed more skulls than the galaxy can supply. Dragon brought his final recommendation to Varrock in the Strategium, while the hive burned below them. The warsmith did not soften the truth. Black Furnace Hive is compromised. Iron Sepulchre Hive will last longer, but not long enough. Orbital stocks are reduced. Gene seed losses are unacceptable. Mortal reserves are collapsing. Fuel attrition cannot be reversed. The swarm is adapting to every static defense and routing around every contamination field. We retain enough fleet strength to evacuate key assets if we begin immediately. Varrock stood before the hololith of Varos. Red infection runes covered half the planet. Evacuate. Withdraw Warband command, gene vaults, relic stores and forge cores. Abandon mortal stock. Once in high orbit, Virus burn the surface and lance the capillary towers. If the Xenos want biomass, deny them biomass. You propose I burn my own world. I propose you deny the enemy your world. Varrock turned. This basilica contains trophies taken before your first augmetic was bolted into your spine. The vaults beneath us hold gene seed bought by 10,000 years of blood. The demon engines in the lower chains are bound to my name. My slaves, my foundries, my banners, my victories. You would have me abandon them and call the ashes strategy. I would have you survive to take another world. Varrock's silence deepened. Dragon did not bow. Pride will not kill the swarm. No, Varrock said, but surrender will kill us before the swarm does. The answer was madness. Dragon knew it. Varrock knew it too, though the Chaos Lord would have murdered the thought in anyone else. Order denied, Varrock said. Prepare the inner hives. Every ship remains under my seal. Dragon's servo arms folded slowly. As commanded. Across Black Furnace Hive, the psychic assault intensified. Zoanthropes and neurothropes gathered beyond the breach, drifting above carpets of gaunts like obscene icons of the hive mind. The air bent around them. The shield generators howled. Mortal cultists began to die without wounds. Some clawed their own eyes out, digging until their fingers reached brain. Others fell to their knees and screamed that something enormous was looking through them. A whole congregation of slave fanatics in the lower shrine district turned their knives inward and opened their throats in perfect unison. Chaos Space Marines felt it differently. Not as voices, never voices. Pressure behind the eyes, weight in the bones. The sensation of standing at the bottom of an ocean while something vast passed overhead. Helm lenses flickered. Autosenses stuttered. Old warriors who had heard demon princes whisper their true names found themselves grinding, their teeth at an enemy that did not know names existed. Among the slaves, a new worship began. It started in the corpse lines, where men dragged bodies toward the furnaces and watched rippers do the same work with cleaner purpose. It spread through ration pits, ammunition gangs and penal pens. They whispered of the true hunger, not a god that lied, not a master that tortured for pleasure, not a corpse emperor who demanded prayer and gave only silence. The true hunger would not enslave them. It would not laugh at them. It would not chain their children to foundry wheels. It would end them. For many on Varos, that had become mercy. Overseers found the first shrine beneath a collapsed loading dock. No icon, no candles, only a circle of kneeling slaves surrounding a severed gaunt head, feeding their own blood into its dead mouth. The overseers killed them all, By the next hour, there were more shrines. Varric heard of this and ordered entire labor blocks burned. The fires lit the hive from within, but the whisper survived. The true hunger comes. The true hunger ends pain. The true hunger does not lie. In orbit, several captains reached the same conclusion with more armor and less honesty. They broke from formation during the shadowed turn of Varos, when the planet's bulk hid them from several ground batteries. 3 escorts and 1 captured Imperial cruiser ignited their drives without authorization, running cold until distance gave them courage. Their commanders transmitted no declaration, no plea, no betrayal speech. They simply fled. Varric learned of it from Dregan, whose voice carried neither surprise nor satisfaction. Unauthorized translation vectors, 4 vessels attempting system exit. Varric stood very still. Names. Dregan listed them. Each name was a wound, not because Varric loved the ships, but because they were his. Destroy them, he said. Ground batteries lack angle, fleet elements moving to intercept. The hololith magnified the fleeing vessels. They burned hard for the outer dark, engines flaring, shields raised against expected punishment from behind. They should have watched ahead. The void before them moved. At first, it looked like drifting cloud, a pale stain against the star field. Then the cloud opened eyes made of heat and hunger. Tyranid bioships slid from the darkness in silence, immense organisms plated in chitin and frozen mucus, tendrils trailing behind them like the roots of dead moons. Spore clouds bloomed around them, living torpedoes detached from their flanks. Bioplasma gathered in throat sacs large enough to swallow frigates. The fleeing cruiser fired first. Lance beams speared into the nearest bioship, burning trenches through its outer shell. The creature shuddered and kept coming. Its tendrils reached the cruiser's prow and wrapped around it with slow, crushing intimacy. Escorts turned, engines flaring in panic. Living torpedoes struck them from multiple vectors, punching through shields and biting into hulls. Boarding organisms entered through the wounds. The Vox caught the first screams. Varric listened. On the hololith, the captured cruiser was pulled apart, not destroyed by one blow, but opened. Its armor peeled. Its decks vented atmosphere and men. Its engines died as feeder organisms entered the machine spaces. One escort detonated in a brief white flash. Another drifted, shedding bodies into space. The last tried to translate into the warp, but its Geller field collapsed under psychic pressure, and the ship vanished in a smear of wrong-colored light, taking its crew into a fate no kinder than consumption. Dregan looked at Varric. The bioships are already in interception positions. Varric stared at the dead vessels, at the living fleet waiting beyond Varos, at the closing trap made not by hatred, but by appetite. For the first time, no one in the strategium spoke of victory. The void above Varos became a slaughterhouse without walls. The planet turned beneath the battle, half hidden by ash storms and spore clouds, its continents burning through breaks in the poisoned atmosphere. Capillary towers had already risen across the equatorial wounds, pale and obscene, their tips thrusting into the upper air like the feeding tubes of some buried god. Around them, mycetic clouds thickened until whole regions of the world vanished beneath living weather. From orbit, the war below looked almost silent. The war above was not. Chaos cruisers opened fire in staggered broadsides, their lance batteries carving white wounds across the dark. Captured Imperial hulks lumbered beside them, their old Aquilus gouged away, their prows crowned in iron horns and corpse banners that drifted uselessly in vacuum. Demon-infested escorts howled across the battle space, their engines burning with unnatural flame, their machine spirits screaming through the Vox as if pain could make them faster. Defense monitors, orbital platforms, mining stations and slave-crewed gun barges formed a ragged iron crown around Varos. Beyond them came the living fleet. The Tyranid bioships did not advance in ranks. They drifted in layered swarms, immense organisms of shell, tendon, frozen mucus, and hardened bone, surrounded by spore clouds and smaller escort beasts. Some resembled void whales split open and remade for predation. Others were armored seeds with mouths large enough to swallow frigates. Their tendrils trailed behind them like the roots of dead forests. Their flanks flexed and pulsed with internal organs the size of manufactorums. They carried no lights, no heraldry, no vox challenge, no identity beyond hunger. The first chaos salvo struck them like the wrath of murdered suns. Lances cut through living hulls and left trenches of boiling tissue behind. Macro shells burst against chitin plates, cracking them apart in sprays of frozen ichor. Torpedoes slammed into one vast feeder vessel and detonated deep enough to split its flank open. Acid blood vented into space in glittering clouds, freezing into shards that tumbled through the battle like broken green glass. A wounded bioship convulsed, its tendrils knotting around itself, birthing chambers rupturing through the tear in its side and spilling half-formed organisms into the void. The ashen maw roared across the command vox. Dragon Mole did not. He stood inside the orbital fire command shrine beneath the Basilica of Cinders, linked by hardline cables to the remaining defense grid. Around him, mortal gun crews sweated beneath the gaze of servitors and warband overseers. Every wall of the chamber shook with recoil telemetry. Every screen vomited static, target data, ammunition warnings, and auger ghosts. Spore clouds clogged half the returns. Bioelectric interference turned distance markers into lies. The living fleet bled, burned, and kept closing. Platform Vaughn missed its firing cycle, Dragon said. A gun servitor beside him clicked. Confirmed, Lord. Reload delay caused by crew panic. Execute the crew. The order went out. On the tactical display, Platform Vaughn's internal pict feed opened for a breath. Dragon saw men in void armor scrambling to clear a jammed shell hoist. One looked up at the sound of the punishment siren. Then the gun nest disciplined servitors opened fire. Heavy rounds tore through the crew, smashing bodies against loading rails, bursting skulls inside helmets, cutting limbs away in red spinning arcs. The shell hoist was cleared by the impact of dying men. Cycle restored, the servitor reported. Good. Fire. Platform Vaughn spat its next shell into a descending spore mass and turned it into flame. Dragon moved to the next failure. Gun barge Callus is drifting from formation. Engine damage, Lord. Can it fire? Yes, Lord. Then it is not damaged enough to drift. Chain its captain to the helm if required. The Void War obeyed him in pieces. Orbital batteries fired until their barrels glowed. Defense platforms hurled torpedoes into the meat of the swarm. Captured hulks rolled their broadsides and emptied entire decks of cannon fire. A demon-infested escort named the Sable Martyr accelerated straight through a cloud of spore mines, tearing itself open, but detonating the mines before they reached the battle line. Its captain laughed over the Vox as his bridge burned around him. The Tyranids absorbed the losses and closed. Living torpedoes detached from bioship flanks and streaked through the void on trails of expelled gas. Some were shot down by flak bursts and point defense lasers, bursting into clouds of acid and bone shards. Others struck shields and died in electrical storms. Enough got through. They punched into hulls and did not explode. They bit. They burrowed. They opened like seed pods and disgorged boarding organisms into gun decks, engine shrines, and slave barracks. Corrosive spores drifted over the chaos line in vast pale curtains. Augers drowned in false returns. Hull plates hissed and pitted where the spores found metal. Men inside void suits screamed when living dust entered filters and bloomed in their lungs. One escort lost its entire dorsal battery when spore growth clogged the firing chambers and shells detonated in place, gutting the deck from within. The ship kept firing from its ventral guns until a bioship's tendrils wrapped around it and crushed it in slow silence. Varrock Threx commanded from the bridge of the Maw of Ruin. The flagship had once been an Imperial Grand Cruiser, Before treachery, boarding hooks, and 10,000 screaming deaths had remade it. Its prow was a snarling iron skull. Its flanks were plated with trophies taken from dead ships. Its cathedral bridge rose beneath stained glass images of burning worlds and murdered saints. Thousands of slaves worked its gun decks, chained to loading rigs and ammunition lifts. Its bridge crew were half mortal, half machine, all afraid. Varrock stood before the forward oculus as lance fire lit his armor. "Bring us closer," he said. The shipmaster, a thin mortal whose spine was fused into the command throne, twitched. "Lord, the bioships are entering tendril range." "Then bring us close enough to cut the tendrils." The shipmaster swallowed. As commanded. The Maw of Ruin advanced. To port, a wounded hive ship drifted, its flank torn open by repeated lance strikes. Its wound gaped like a continent-sized mouth, venting green acid blood and clouds of internal steam. Korvac's red hand saw it from the assault decks and demanded entry. Varrock granted it because slaughter had to be spent somewhere. Boarding torpedoes launched from the Maw in a black iron storm. They crossed the void between tracer fire and spore clouds, some bursting under Tyranid interception organisms, others reaching the torn flesh of the bioship. Korvax rode in the foremost torpedo, chained in place among his berserkers, chain axe mag locked across his chest, helm grill filled with his breath. The torpedo struck. It did not clang against metal. It sank into meat. The impact harnesses snapped open. The forward cutter charges detonated. Wet heat flooded the compartment. Korvax tore free of his chains and charged through the breach with his warriors at his back. He had expected corridors. He found organs. The inside of the hive ship pulsed around him, walls flexing with muscular contractions, the floor slick beneath his boots and threaded with veins thicker than anchor cables. No lumen glow, no machine hum, no deck markings, no command shrines. Only red darkness and the wet rhythm of an enormous living thing continuing to function while wounded. Digestive canals opened along the passage, steaming with acid strong enough to etch ceramite. Membranes shivered as the boarding party passed. Birthing sacs hung from vaulted flesh ceilings, some already splitting to release pale shapes that hit the floor and unfolded into claws. Korvax laughed and charged. His chain axe chewed through the first immune beast that lunged from a side sphincter, spraying hot ichor across the pulsing wall. His berserkers fired into the birthing sacs until they burst, spilling half-grown organisms and amniotic slime across the floor. Bolt shells detonated in living tissue. Flamers washed the corridor in burning promethium, charring flesh black and making the ship convulse around them. The hive ship responded as a body responds to infection. Walls tightened, tubes ruptured, spraying acid across the invaders. A berserker slipped into a digestive channel and vanished to the waist before his brothers hauled him out. His legs remained behind, dissolved to smoking bones and black armor scraps. He kept fighting on his knees until feeder organisms poured from a wound in the ceiling and buried him. The ship grew defenders as they advanced, not summoned, not deployed through doors. Grown, sacs split, muscle gates opened. Immune beasts poured into the path of the boarders, white and red and chitinous, their bodies shaped for the dimensions of the passage and the weapons of the intruders. The first wave died beneath axes and bolters. The second came lower, hugging the walls, striking at knee joints and weapon arms. The third emerged with thicker frontal plates, where bolt shells had done the most damage. Korvax smashed one aside and drove forward through a curtain of vein. "Tissue. Where is your heart?" he roared. "Where is the thing I killed to make you die?" The hive ship gave no answer. It simply tightened another passage behind him, cutting off a handful of berserkers and crushing them in folds of contracting muscle. Their armor screamed. Their bones broke loudly enough to carry over the vox. Blood sprayed from their sealed joints before the channel swallowed them. Rage meant nothing there. The creature treated them as infection, not champions, not murderers, not sons of lost legions. Infection. On Varos, in the astropathic ruin, Malachor Vare felt something beyond the battle. He sat chained to a warded throne because his seizures had become violent enough to break his own bones. Brass hooks pierced the flesh beneath his collarbones, anchoring him in place. His eyes were open, but rolled black. Around him, dead psychers lay in circles, their skulls split by backlash. The shadow in the warp pressed so heavily now that even thought required pain. Yet through that pressure, far beyond the dying moon paths and the orbital fire, he sensed the shape behind the invasion. Not a queen as mortals understood queens, not a sovereign with pride, name or face. A Norn queen, immense and distant within the belly of the fleet, a reproductive intelligence and genetic furnace, shaping the war with every death fed back through the synaptic web. It was not giving orders in words, it was receiving wounds as information, it was remembering weapons, it was tasting toxins, it was birthing answers. Malachor tried to recoil. The vision held him under. He saw shells strike carapace and become data. He saw warp poison enter alien organs and become lesson. He saw Korvax's chain axe chewing flesh inside the bioship, and the ship growing thicker tissue along future passages. He saw Dregon's firing cycles reflected in swarm movement. He saw Varroc's pride as nothing more than resistance density around a biomass node. He wept blood because the future had narrowed again. No throne, no victory, no demon host salvation. Only the feeding mathematics of an intelligence that did not know it was cruel. In orbit, the demon-possessed cruiser Grave Psalm broke formation. Its hull had been alive with bound warp entities long before the battle. Faces pushed from its armor plates, eyes opened in gun barrels, its engines burned with impossible colors. When its captain died during the first spore breach, the thing in the ship's core took fuller control and turned toward the largest hive ship in range. "Ramming speed!" it sang over the open vox in 1,000 stolen voices. Dregon saw the course change. "Grave Psalm, correct vector." The cruiser ignored him. "Grave Psalm, correct vector, or be fired upon." The stolen voices laughed. "We go to bite the eater." It accelerated. Tyranid spores burst against its prow. Living torpedoes punched into its flanks and were swallowed by demonic flesh metal. Warp flames streamed from rents in its hull. The Grave Psalm struck the hive ship bow first, with enough force to crack the larger organism's outer shell and drive its prow deep into meat. For a breath, the Chaos Fleet cheered. Then the hive ship swallowed. Its wound opened wider around the embedded cruiser. Tendrils curled inward, not around the hull, but into it, forcing themselves through breaches, gun ports, launch bays, and cathedral windows. Boarding organisms poured both ways. The possessed cruiser screamed in ecstasy, then fury, then something too close to fear. Its guns fired from inside the wound, blasting tunnels through alien tissue. Acid flooded back through the decks. Demon faces melted from the walls as feeder organisms consumed the mortal crew, the bound flesh, the meat beneath the metal. The Grave Psalm tried to detonate its warp core. The hive ship's tendrils reached the engine shrine first. The explosion never came. Instead, the cruiser dimmed from bow to stern, as if its soul had been sucked through its own wounds. Its hull split. Its spine broke. Tyranid organisms gutted it from within, while the larger bioship closed its flesh around the wreck, holding it in place like prey in a jaw. Dregon watched the icon vanish. Mark Grave Psalm destroyed. The servitor clicked. "Destroyed, Lord." Below, spores fell in greater numbers. That was the bitter arithmetic. Every bioship killed above Varos burst open and rained more matter into the atmosphere. Every wounded organism vented spores, acid, larvae, and half-formed broods. Every victory in orbit thickened the storm below. Defense lasers that carved open living hulls birthed new clouds of descent organisms. Torpedoes that split escort beasts scattered their contents across the planet. The orbital war was not preventing invasion. It was grinding pieces of the fleet into a rain of flesh over the world. Dragon understood before Varrock accepted it. "The defense grid is accelerating planetary contamination," the Warsmith said over Command Vox. Varrock's reply came from the Maw of Ruin, cold and furious. "Explain." "Bioships rupture under fire. Their internal broods survive atmospheric entry in spore mass. Our kill rate above orbit is increasing the saturation of surface vectors. We stop firing and they descend intact." "Yes." "Then keep firing." Dragon did. The living fleet closed. The Maw of Ruin killed 3 bioships before the largest reached it. Its lance batteries burned through one escort organism from maw to tail. Its macro cannons shattered another into tumbling sections. Its dorsal guns cracked a feeder vessel open and spilled its organs across the void. Slaves died by the thousands in its gun decks, crushed by recoil, cooked by overheated plasma conduits, dragged screaming into walls by boarding organisms that had entered through acid-melted wounds. Varrock stood at the bridge oculus and watched the giant come. It was larger than any ship in his fleet, a hive ship whose carapace was scarred by lance fire and pocked with craters. It had crossed the kill zone through losses that would have broken a mortal armada. Bioplasma gathered along its forward organs, swelling in translucent sacs that glowed like sickly suns. "Brace," the shipmaster whispered. Varrock drew his blade. "Fire everything." The Maw of Ruin fired. The hive ship answered. Bioplasma struck the flagship across its prow and starboard flank. Void shields flared, shrieked, and collapsed in sheets of blue lightning. The second impact burned through armor, cathedral decks, and crew compartments, turning thousands of slaves into shadows burned against bulkheads. The bridge heaved. Stained glass exploded inward. Mortal officers were cut apart by flying shards. A command servitor burst as its cogitator spine overloaded and sprayed oil across the throne steps. The Maw's engines roared, trying to pull away. The hive ship's tendrils reached it. They came through the void like living spires, each one thicker than a hive tower, ridged with muscle and hook growths. The first wrapped around the flagship's wounded prow. The second struck amidships, crushing gun decks flat. The third speared through the lower hull and emerged trailing atmosphere, bodies, fire, and chains. The Maw of Ruin shuddered as more tendrils latched on, dragging the Grand Cruiser from its battle line. The shipmaster screamed that the drives were failing. Dragon's voice cut through the Vox, harsh with static. "Maw of Ruin, your orbital vector is degrading." Varrock looked through the shattered oculus. Below him, Varos turned in fire and cloud. The flagship was being pulled toward the atmosphere. Around it, Tyranid spores bloomed like carrion flowers. The living tendrils tightened. The Maw of Ruin, pride of the Ashen Maw, killer of worlds, shrine of murder and iron, began to fall. The Maw of Ruin fell burning through the upper atmosphere of Varos, dragged by living tendrils and wreathed in the fire of its own descent. It did not die. That alone became the first miracle of the counterstroke. The Grand Cruiser struck the poisoned sky like a wounded god, its void shields gone, its prow crushed, its lower decks open to the storm. Tyranid tendrils still clung to its hull, wrapped around gun ports and cathedral spires, crushing towers of black iron inward as the ship screamed through cloud and ash. Bioplasma wounds glowed along its flank. Atmosphere tore through ruptured chapels. Thousands of slaves burned in their harnesses as the gun decks became furnaces. Yet the engines answered when Varrock Threx demanded obedience, and the ship's machine soul, mad with pain and old hate, refused the indignity of extinction. The Maw broke free of one tendril over the northern slag plains. The severed limb whipped away into cloud, bleeding green fire. The shipmaster died fused into his throne, his body cooked inside its augmetic cradle. Varrock took command from the shattered bridge, one gauntlet locked around a broken rail, his tusked helm blackened by smoke. Around him, Mortal officers crawled through glass, blood, and sacred oils. The bridge oculus had cracked from crown to floor, showing the world below in flashes of red cloud and burning hive light. "Impact?" Dragon's voice rasped over the command vox, distorted by the storm and the dying ship. Varrock looked down at Varos. "No," he said. "Arrival." The maw of ruin did not crash into the planet. It scraped the sky open and tore across the ash wastes above Black Furnace Hive, shedding armor plates, corpses, and burning shrines. Its remaining engines howled hard enough to split themselves. It came to rest beyond the broken Manufactorum continent, half buried in a trench of its own making, prow embedded in slag and corpse mud, stern still vomiting flame into the sky. From its wounds came the ashen maw. They gathered because there was nowhere left to retreat. Terminators marched from the flagship's broken assault bays, huge in ancient tactical dreadnought plate, their shoulders plated with trophies and flayed scripture. Combi bolters locked into firing position. Chain fists purred. Lightning claws sparked in the ash. Raptors descended from the smoke in shrieking packs, jump engines coughing black fire as they landed on broken hab towers and ruined statue plinths. Korvac's red hand came with his berserkers, armor painted in old gore and fresh ichor, chain axe raised like a sacrament. Plague-corrupted legionaries answered from sealed transports, their armor swollen and split with rusted growths, their presence drawing flies that could not have lived in the poisoned air. Dragon Mole brought the engines. The Warsmith had emptied the lower chains. Demon engines crawled from Black Furnace Hive and the Basilica vaults in a procession of iron madness. Brass scorpions dragged their bladed limbs through ash. Mauler fiends strained against rune-burned leash cables until their handlers were torn apart and eaten by the machines they guided. Forge fins climbed over collapsed walls and spat streams of incandescent death into the swarm. A corrupted god engine, crippled since a war older than most imperial bloodlines, took its first steps in centuries. Its cathedral carapace leaned beneath chains and banners. Its princeps was a screaming thing wired into a throne of bone and brass, but its plasma annihilator still glowed with the heat of captured suns. Behind them came the slave legions. Millions of mortals were driven forward from the surviving pits, from ration holds, from furnace warrens, from penal cages and collapsed barracks. They carried laser guns, autoguns, mining charges, chain spears, promethium bombs, and in many cases nothing but a collar and fear. Overseers walked behind them with shock whips and stub pistols. Gun servitors tracked the backs of their heads. The slaves understood before the first order was given. They were not an army. They were the ground upon which the army would walk. They were living mine clearers, flesh screens, noise, heat, panic, and delay. Varrock stood atop the cracked prow of the Maw of Ruin as the host formed beneath him. His armor had been repaired only enough to keep him alive. One pauldron was split. Acid had eaten grooves into his breastplate. His cloak of preserved faces was half burned away, the remaining dead features fused into shriveled masks. He held his blade in one hand and the Warband standard in the other, its cloth made from stitched imperial banners and its pole crowned with the skulls of rival captains. Before him, the plains between Black Furnace Hive and the eastern capillary growths moved with Tyranid life. The synapse concentration was visible even without auspex. There, beyond the corpse fields and digestion lakes, the swarm thickened around a rising forest of pale towers and chitinous nodes. Hive tyrants stalked among the lesser organisms. Tyranid warriors moved in disciplined packs. Zoanthropes drifted like obscene lanterns, their swollen skulls pulsing with witchlight. Beneath the surface, Dragon's augurs had detected buried masses that pulsed in time with the swarm's movements. Malachor had called it a nerve knot in the flesh of the invasion. Varrock called it a throat, and throats existed to be cut. All formations advance, he said. The counterstroke began with artillery, brass guns the size of hab blocks fired from the ruins of Black Furnace Hive. Their shells crossed the sky, trailing smoke and demonic laughter, then landed among the Tyranid tide with continents shaking force. The first impacts turned entire broods into clouds of vapor, shattered warriors, split carnifexes, and blasted craters through the carpet of gaunts. The corrupted god engine fired next. Its plasma weapon drew a line of white sunfire across the battlefield, erasing everything in its path so completely that ash turned to glass and alien bodies became shadows burned into stone. Drop pods fell through the spore clouds. They screamed down, trailing black flame, impact thrusters firing too late and too hard. Some were caught by gargoyle flocks and living mines before they landed, bursting apart in the air and raining dead legionaries across the field. Others struck true, punching into the Tyranid lines and opening like iron flowers. Chaos Marines charged out firing. Terminators emerged through steam and gore, combi bolters roaring, chain fists carving into anything that came close. The slave legions ran. They did not charge. They were driven. Shock collars detonated among those who slowed. Overseers shot men who looked back. The first ranks entered the minefields of living spore growths and disappeared in blossoms of acid, poison, and chitin fragments. Their deaths exposed safe paths for the armor columns behind them. Mortals fell into digestion pits and screamed until the fluids stripped them down to bone. Others reached the gaunt lines and fired until they were swallowed, their bodies buying seconds, their seconds buying range. Predators, Vindicators, and captured Lehman Russ tanks rolled forward over the dead, guns hammering. Their tracks crushed slaves, gaunts, and corpses into one red paste. Raptors screamed overhead and slammed into the gargoyle flocks, chain blades cutting wings apart in mid-air. Plague Marines advanced through toxin clouds without haste, firing bolters into oncoming beasts, their rotting armor absorbing venoms that killed mortals by the thousand. For the first time since the Tyranids had reached Varos, the swarm recoiled. Not in fear. The recoil was local, tactical, immediate. The sheer violence of the offensive punched a wound through the outer broods. Artillery erased the first response waves. Demon engines smashed into the Tyranid front and did what they had been forged to do. A brass scorpion impaled a carnifex on its tail weapon, lifted it screaming without sound, and tore it into 3 pieces with its claws. A Mauler fiend plunged into a tide of hormagaunts and spun, chain limbs whipping, reducing hundreds to purple mist and shattered shell. The illusion of victory spread faster than fire. The Ashen Maw roared. Slaves who had expected immediate death found themselves alive behind advancing tanks and began screaming praise to the dark gods with cracked throats. Korvax heard the sound and laughed as if the galaxy had remembered its proper shape. He found his glory in the plaza of the Broken Aquila, a vast square before a manufactorum gate where an imperial monument had been melted into a heap of slag long ago. Now the plaza was carpeted with corpses so thick the ground was hidden. Tyranids came at him across that carpet in waves, and at their heart came a carnifex brood. There were 4 of them, each larger than a battle tank, their carapaces scarred by artillery, their claws broad enough to cut a rhino in half. Korvax ran to meet them before his warriors could form around him. The first carnifex lowered its head and charged. Korvax did not dodge until the last breath. He leapt aside, chain axe biting into its forelimb as it passed. The weapon screamed through chitin and tendon. The beast crashed into a broken statue behind him, shattering stone and bone. His berserkers hit the second carnifex together, chain axes grinding against its shell, crack grenades detonating beneath its belly. It killed 3 of them with one sweep, crushing armor and bodies into the corpse carpet. Korvax climbed the first beast while it rose. Talons scraped his armor. A lesser gaunt bit into his thigh seal, and he kicked it away with enough force to burst its abdomen. He drove his axe into the carnifex's neck, pulled himself higher by the embedded weapon, and hammered his bolt pistol into the side of its skull. He fired until the magazine emptied. The final shell detonated behind the creature's eye, blowing a torrent of brain matter, ichor and bone chips across his helm. The Carnifex fell. Korvax rode it down, laughing. The second struck him before he could stand. Its claw closed around his torso and squeezed. His armor screamed. Warning runes flashed across his lenses. He spat blood inside his helm and drove his chain axe into the joint of the claw, again and again, until the weapon teeth snapped, one after another, and the limb came apart in wet strands. His berserkers died around him, dragged down by gaunts, impaled by bone zords, crushed under hooves. He did not care. He was drowning in the only heaven he understood. "Witness me," he roared. No one answered but the swarm. Dragon's demon engines tore open the road to the synapse knot. The warsmith advanced behind them in a land raider whose hull was marked with old siege script and fresh acid scars. His command net was a storm of orders, executions, and corrections. When one armor column drifted too far toward a digestion lake, he ordered its lead tank destroyed to halt the rest. When a demon engine broke leash and turned toward the slave reserves, he triggered the binding runes in its spine and sent it convulsing into the Tyranid line instead. His warfare was not beautiful. It was efficient cruelty, given tracks and guns. Malachor walked near the center of the spearhead, surrounded by Terminators, whose task was to keep him alive and kill him if he turned. He had no strength left for pride. His armor shook with every step. Blood had dried black beneath his eyes. Yet he raised a warding field against the zoanthropes, pouring what remained of his sorcery into a dome of flickering unreality above the advance. The psychic backlash struck it like falling mountains. Zoanthropes pulsed beyond the smoke. Neurothropes drifted among them, directing the pressure. Mortal slaves beneath the edge of the shield screamed and clawed at their faces. Some tore their own tongues out. Others collapsed with skulls caved inward by invisible force. Chaos Marines staggered, but kept moving. Malachor screamed continuously, not from fear, but because the effort of holding the field was splitting his mind open. Varos strode beneath that shield with his chosen Terminators. The Chaos Lord saw the target ahead and believed, for several minutes, that he had been right. The synapse concentration buckled. A hive tyrant fell beneath Lascanon fire. Warriors died under artillery saturation. One zoanthrope burst in midair, its skull splitting like overripe fruit and showering the gaunts below in psychic flame. The buried nodes trembled under the tread of demon engines. The swarm's local coordination faltered. Gaunts struck one another. Gargoyle flocks lost formation. A Carnifex charged into a digestion pool and sank screaming without sound. Varrock lifted his blade. "Forward! Cut the throat!" Then the throat opened and revealed itself to be a hydra. The target was not a single beast, not a command creature enthroned beneath chitin, not even the nearest cluster of hive tyrants. It was a layered synaptic web spread through air, ground, and flesh. Tyrants anchored it. Warriors extended it. Zoanthropes amplified it. Neurothropes shaped it. Buried node creatures pulsed beneath the surface like hearts in a buried giant. When one node died, another took its burden. When one tyrant fell, the web shivered and tightened elsewhere. Malachor saw the truth and tried to warn them. His voice broke across the vox in a wash of blood static. "It is not a head. It is a nervous system." Dragon heard him and understood. Varrock heard him and refused. The chaos plan worked for minutes more. Then the surrounding swarms turned. From the north, broods that had been fighting the remnants of Black Furnace Hive disengaged and flowed toward the spearhead. From the south, gargoyle clouds descended from above the ash banks. From beneath the corpse fields came raveners, trigons, and burrowing organisms that had allowed the advance to pass over them. Behind the chaos armor, the safe paths through the spore growths closed as new organisms flooded in. The slave legions at the rear vanished under a tide of gaunts before they could even turn their guns around. Dragon's land raider shook as something struck it from below. "Trap," he said. No one needed the word explained. Varrock reached the central crater as the largest hive tyrant came to meet him. It strode through the ruin of its own. Dead, taller than a dreadnought, crowned in blade ridges, guarded by hulking tyrant guard whose bodies intercepted Lascanon fire and kept moving. Varrock's terminators opened fire. Combi bolters hammered, chain fists revved. The tyrant guard absorbed the first impacts and died in pieces, chitin blown open, limbs severed, bodies falling only when their internal structure had been ruined beyond motion. Then Varrock and the hive tyrant met. The creature struck first, Bonesaw descending in a blur of alien strength. Varrock caught the blow on his demon blade, the impact driving him to one knee and cracking the stone beneath him. He fired his combi bolter into its torso at point-blank range. Shells detonated under layered carapace, blowing chunks of alien flesh across his armor. The tyrant did not slow. Its lash whip snapped around one of his terminators, dragged the warrior forward, and hurled him into the path of a crushing talon that split his armor open from helm to groin. Varrock rose with a roar. He cut into the tyrant's leg, severing muscle cables and cracking chitin. It staggered. He stepped inside its reach, taking a talon through his pauldron, feeling the point bite into the meat beneath. Pain became clarity. He drove his blade upward under the creature's rib plates and twisted. The demon-bound edge shrieked as it drank alien ichor. The hive tyrant hammered him with its free limb, once, twice, hard enough to fracture ceramite and break one of his ribs. Varrock did not fall. "All things bleed," he snarled. He ripped the blade free and hacked into the tyrant's neck. The first blow opened shell. The second cut tendon. The third struck deep enough to loose a flood of steaming brain fluid down its chest. The creature reared, synaptic energy flaring around its crown. Varrock jammed his blade into the wound and fired the underslung melter charge built into the hilt. The hive tyrant's head and upper spine exploded in a burst of white heat and black ichor. Its body crashed to the ground. For one heartbeat, the swarm around the crater faltered. Varrock stood atop the corpse, blade raised, armor smoking, Vox grill pouring a triumphant roar across the battlefield. Then a buried node pulsed beneath the earth. A zoanthrope shrieked without sound. A cluster of warriors turned as one. The gaunts surged forward with renewed precision. Another synaptic presence took command as smoothly as a second heart, taking up the beat. Varrock's roar died in his throat. Around him, the counterstroke collapsed into encirclement. Dragon's demon engines were being dragged down by weight of bodies. Korvax's plaza had vanished beneath a living hill of gaunts, and Carnifex dead. Malakor's ward flickered, cracked, and began to peel apart under psychic pressure. The armor columns tried to reverse, and found their retreat closed by burrowers. Drop pods burned in the distance. Slave legions dissolved into screaming pockets of meat. Above, the sky disappeared. Gargoyles filled it from horizon to horizon, their wings overlapping until no red light reached the ground. Spores fell through them in thick curtains, bursting among the chaos lines, coating armor and flesh in living filth. The sun vanished. The air became black wings, poison rain and hunger. The Ashen Moor stood at the center of its greatest offensive, surrounded on every side by a galaxy of teeth. The collapse did not begin with a rout. It began with obedience continuing after victory had become impossible. The Ashen Moor fought on because they had forgotten how to do anything else. Their bolters still roared. Their chain blades still screamed. Their wounded still cursed. Their dying still killed whatever came close enough to reach. Around them, the plains before Black Furnace Hive churned with so much blood, ash, acid, and corpse slurry that the ground no longer held a single honest color. Tanks burned in black pools. Drop pods lay cracked open like empty seed husks. Demon engines thrashed under living carpets of chitin, dragging claws through the swarm until their joints locked with gore and their furnace hearts burst. The counterstroke had become a pocket of murder surrounded by a world-sized mouth. Korvac's red hand stood at the center of the plaza of the broken Aquila, though the plaza was gone beneath bodies. His berserkers were gone with it, not dead in the clean manner of warriors slain by equals, not claimed by a champion, not split by a relic. Blade, not executed under the gaze of laughing gods. They were being buried by the small. That was the insult. A mountain of hormagaunts crashed against the last of them. Termagants fired living ammunition into cracked armor seals. Rippers crawled over fallen bodies and forced themselves through torn joints, through wounds, through shattered visors. Gargoyles descended from the blackened sky and clung to warriors like carrion birds with knives for feet. The lesser organisms died in heaps, but there were always more beneath them, behind them, above them, climbing over their own dead until the berserkers could no longer swing freely. Korvax had killed carnifexes. He had split warriors from skull to pelvis. He had torn the head from a tyrant guard and beaten gaunts aside with it until the skull came apart in his fist. His armor was open in 6 places. One horn had been shorn from his helm. His chain axe had lost most of its teeth, and still he drove the weapon into alien bodies with the force of a pile driver, reducing chitin and meat to spray. "Come on," he roared. A hormagaunt leapt onto his chest, and he crushed its head against his breastplate. Another tore into his thigh. He kicked, pulping it against a corpse mound. Rippers climbed his back. He reached over his shoulder, seized a handful and ripped them free, taking strips of his own armor cabling with them. Acid smoked against his gauntlets. He ignored the pain. "Come on." His last surviving berserker, Brother Garvek, vanished under a tide of pale feeder organisms. Korvax heard him over the vox, laughing and choking as they chewed through his abdominal plate. "Blood," Garvek rasped. "Blood, brother." Then his reactor pack detonated and carved a crater in the swarm. For 3 breaths, there was space around Korvax. He stood alone in the red hole, smoke pouring from his armor, chain axe snarling weakly in his grip. The Tyranids filled the space again. No carnifex stepped forward to claim him. No hive tyrant honored him with a killing stroke. No synapse beast offered the theatrical dignity of a duel. The swarm buried him in lesser bodies. Claws found his knees. Teeth found his elbows. Acid spat across his helm lenses. A termagant shot living beetles into the wound beneath his pauldron, and they burrowed inward, eating muscle, nerve, and black carapace. Korvax killed until he could no longer lift his arm. The last thing he saw was not a worthy foe. It was a ripper forcing itself through the cracked lens of his helm. Dragon Mole heard Korvax die as a distortion in the command vox and marked the loss without ceremony. He was retreating through the manufactorum tunnels beneath Black Furnace Hive, though he did not call it retreat. He called it relocation of command assets under extreme pressure. Around him, the walls shook as the swarm entered the hive's lower ducts in numbers beyond reason. The tunnels had been built for ore trains, fuel pipes, munition crawlers, and slave columns. Now they carried panic, smoke, alien bodies, and the metallic thunder of collapsing defenses. Dragon moved with a knot of iron apostates and mortal gun crews carrying the last portable ammunition reliquaries. His servo arms twitched over his shoulders, firing, cutting, sealing, measuring. Every intersection became a calculation. Every blast door became currency. "Squad Val, hold junction Gamma Ash," he ordered. The Chaos Marines ahead of him turned. Their leader's helms snapped toward the Warsmith. "The swarm is already in the side vents." "Yes." "We will be surrounded." "Yes." There was a brief silence. Then the squad leader laughed once, bitter and low. "Iron without pity." "Pity is inefficient," Dragon said. "Hold." Squad Val obeyed, because they were still warriors of the Ashen Moor, and because refusing Dragon in that moment would only have meant being shot from behind before being eaten from ahead. They took positions at the junction, bolters raised, while the Warsmith and the command remnants passed through the next armored gate. The door began to descend. One of Squad Val turned as the blast door ground down behind him. Through the narrowing gap, Dregan saw Gaunt spill into the junction. He saw bolter fire light the tunnel. He saw one legionary dragged down, then another. The squad leader stood his ground, firing into the tide until a warrior's blade punched through his chest and lifted him from the floor. The blast door sealed. The Vox filled with impacts against the other side. Dregan walked on. He sealed 3 more doors on his own warriors before reaching the inner transit spine. Each time, the screams lasted less long. Each time, the swarm learned faster. By the final gate, Raveners had already reached the ceiling ducts before the door descended. Dregan personally burned them out with a wrist-mounted flamer, watching their bodies fall in smoking coils onto the mortal crew beneath. One gunloader screamed as acidic blood dissolved his face. Dregan stepped over him without slowing. In the apothecarian beneath the basilica, Nerez Halvek found his sacred work already being eaten. The gene seed vaults had been sealed behind adamantium doors, warded against demons, thieves, rivals, and time. They had not been designed against hunger that arrived through drainage veins, ventilation cracks, and the bodies of the dead themselves. Nerez entered through the outer seal with 3 surgical servitors and a squad of plague-marked legionaries. He expected contamination. He did not expect violation. The apothecarian was alive with feeder organisms. They carpeted the floor in pale ripples, crawling over operating slabs, gene caskets, corpse hooks, and stasis coffins. Rippers had forced themselves into the dead laid out for harvest, burrowing through abdomen, throat, and chest cavity with efficient greed. Fallen chaos. Marines whose progenoid glands should have been preserved for the Warband's future were open, emptied, stripped from the inside. Their reinforced bones showed tooth marks. Their black carapace had been peeled away in strips and dragged into the vents. Nerez shot the first cluster with his plasma pistol. The blast vaporized a dozen and splashed the vault wall with molten slime. More came through the smoke. "No," he said. His voice was softer than rage. The servitors began firing. The plague marines waded in with bolters and knives, crushing organisms beneath corrupted boots. It made no difference. The Rippers were not trying to win a battle. They were already succeeding in their purpose. Gene seed caskets had been gnawed open. Preservation fluids drained across the floor, mixed with alien digestive enzymes. Sacred organs, stolen from loyalists, harvested from brothers, cultivated through centuries of war, were dissolving into useless rot. Nerez tore open a stasis vault and found a progenoid mass covered in translucent tendrils. It pulsed once, then collapsed into slurry. The apothecary butcher stared. He had butchered captives alive for organs. He had cut brothers open while they begged for death. He had grown warriors from stolen flesh and forced mutations into bodies that resisted him. He had never thought of himself as sentimental. Yet the sight of the vault dissolving struck deeper than grief. It was erasure. A warband could lose warriors. It could lose ships. It could lose worlds. Without gene seed, it lost tomorrow. A feeder organism climbed the side of an opened casket, its belly swollen with what had once been legacy. Nerez caught it in his narthecium claws and held it before his red lenses. "You do not know what you have eaten," he whispered. The Ripper snapped at him. He crushed it slowly enough to hear each internal sac burst. Far above, on the broken terraces of the Basilica of Cinders, Malachor Vare watched the horizon and understood at last. Chaos was cruel in the shape of men. That had always been its intimacy, its theater, its power. A lord chose who screamed. A priest chose which throat opened before the altar. A demon whispered the secret name of a victim and took pleasure in the answering terror. Even the gods, vast and monstrous as they were, had hungers that resembled mortal sins made infinite. Rage, desire, change, decay, pride, jealousy, triumph, betrayal. Chaos looked into a soul and found the hook by which to drag it screaming. The Tyranids did not look.
They passed over souls like wind over ash. Malachor stared across the plains where capillary towers rose by the score, then by the 100. They pulsed along the horizon, pale columns veined with red and black, drinking from digestion lakes that had once been battlefields, slave districts, and oceans of industrial runoff. Corpse slurry flowed toward them in rivers. Blood pits emptied into them. The liquefied dead of Black Furnace Hive, the wasted fuel of manufactorums, the bodies of cultists. Penal troops, mutants, chaos marines, Tyranids, and demonic hosts all vanished into the same upward pumping motion. Above the towers, orbiting digestion vessels waited like open mouths. Malachor felt the shadow thicken as the planet fed the fleet. Every soul that died beneath the swarm was not savored, not damned, not elevated, not mocked. It was silenced, meat to fluid, fluid to mass, mass to war. The simplicity of it was obscene. Chaos was personal. The hive mind was absolute. That was worse. In the command yard below the basilica, Varrock Threx tried to make fear serve him one last time. The survivors gathered beneath cracked statues and burning banners. Terminators with depleted magazines, raptors with broken jump packs, plague marines leaking fumes from split armor, mortal officers whose faces had gone slack with exhaustion, slave regiments reduced to bands of ash-coated men clutching empty rifles, axes, chains, tools, anything. The screams of the outer walls rolled over them in waves. Varrock mounted a fallen demon engine and raised his blade. "Stand," he commanded. "Stand, or I will kill every man who turns his back. Stand, or your names will be fed to the furnace and forgotten. Stand, or I will nail your souls to this world and make your ghosts carry ammunition for eternity." Once, those words would have made armies obey. The slaves looked at him and did not move. Not because they had become brave, not because hope had reached them. There was no hope left on Varos. Their fear had simply changed masters. Behind Varrock, the swarm had turned the battlefield into an ecosystem. The air itself was hostile. Spores entered lungs and birthed choking growths. Pools dissolved flesh into nutrient broth. Rippers moved through corpse heaps like white maggots in a wound. Gargoyles nested in the broken towers. Lictors stalked command routes. The ground shook with burrowers. Every wall sweated acid. Every shadow could unfold into claws. To the slaves, punishment from Varrock was now only one death among millions, and not the cleanest. A slave officer dropped his rifle. The sound carried. Varrock shot him through the chest. The officer fell, smoking, and the men around him did not pick up the rifle. "Advance," Varrock said. No one advanced. The slave regiments broke. Some ran toward the inner gates and were cut down by servitors. Some ran toward the swarm, screaming prayers to the true hunger, arms spread as if greeting deliverance. They were taken apart before they reached the first gaunt line. Some fell to their knees and waited. Some turned their weapons on overseers. A few simply sat among the dead and stared up at the black sky until spores settled on their faces. It was not cowardice alone. The battlefield had become a mouth, and the slaves could no longer pretend any direction led out of it. A Chaos Marine staggered toward Varrock through the spreading disorder. His armor had once been black and bronze. Now it was grey with ash and streaked with acid burns. One arm hung useless. His helm was gone, revealing a face flayed on one side down to the teeth. He still carried a bolter, though the magazine was empty. "My lord," he said. Varrock turned, blade lowered. The warrior looked beyond him, toward the capillary towers and the sky thick with spores. His voice was raw, not with fear, but with something more dangerous. "Have the gods abandoned us?" The words struck harder than any shell. Nearby warriors heard, mortal officers heard. Even Malachor, standing high above, felt the question move through the dying warband like a crack through glass. Varrock stepped close. For a moment, he might have answered. He might have lied beautifully. He might have cursed the gods,
invoked them, promised vengeance, demanded faith, turned despair into hatred. Instead, he drove his blade through the warrior's throat. The point burst from the back of the legionary's neck in a spray of dark blood. Varrock leaned close until his tusked helm nearly touched the dying warrior's face. "The gods abandon only the weak," he said. He ripped the blade free. The Chaos Marine collapsed at his feet, hands twitching around an empty weapon. No one cheered. That silence made Varrock angrier than defiance. Malachor heard the silence and made his decision. He descended beneath the basilica alone, leaving behind the terraces, the burning banners, and the corpse wind. He moved through old passages, known only to seers, assassins, and cowards wise enough to survive. The walls sweated, the lights flickered. Far below, the dreadnought Garul still raged in his chains, bellowing for release, but Malachor did not turn toward the entombed ancient. There was no victory in releasing another monster into a larger maw. He reached the subcrypt beneath the central fortress, where the oldest stones of Varos had been carved before the Imperium had claimed the world, before the Ashen Maw had stolen it, before the first demon engine had been chained in its foundries. The chamber was circular, black and dry. Its floor was marked with warding circles Malachor himself had etched across centuries. He had told Varrock they were for defense. That had been true once. Now they were for escape. He cut his palm and let blood fall into the grooves. The old runes awakened, glowing with dull violet light. The shadow in the warp pressed down at once, smothering, crushing, filling the chamber with the sensation of drowning beneath teeth. Malachor fell to one knee, but continued the rite. He spoke names he had sworn never to speak on Varos. He offered secrets stolen from Varrock's vaults. He offered the locations of hidden gene caches, forgotten raids, buried oaths. He offered anything that might buy a path. The air split. Not cleanly, not safely. A warp route opened beneath the fortress like an infected wound, its edges trembling under the pressure of the shadow. Colors without names leaked into the crypt. Voices whispered from the far side, eager, amused, false and familiar. Malachor laughed through blood-slick lips. Above him, the Ashen Maw died. Behind him, the hive mind pressed closer. Before him, damnation opened its arms. The sorcerer stepped toward it alone. The warp fissure beneath the Basilica of Cinders did not open as a gate. It opened as a wound. Malachor Vere had carved the rite into the black stones centuries before, telling Varrock Threx that the circles were wards, that the sigils were anchors, that the hidden channels beneath the fortress existed to bleed excess immaterial pressure into the sacrificial crypts. Those had not been lies, not entirely. The best betrayals wore old truths as armor. The sorcerer had built the ritual for defense, then refined it for flight, then hidden its final purpose inside layers of obedience, flattery, and silence. Now the old runes burned violet beneath his blood. The chamber split down the center. The sound was not thunder. Thunder was honest. This was a scream stretched through stone, flesh, and thought, a noise made by reality, remembering that it could be harmed. The air bent inward. The walls sweated black ichor. Chains hanging from the ceiling twisted, though no hand touched them. Colors leaked through the fracture, wrong and bright, smearing across the crypt in pulses that made the bones of dead slaves rattle in their alcoves. Malachor staggered toward the opening with one hand pressed to his chest. He could feel the passage beyond it, narrow, unstable, poisoned by pressure, but present, a torn vein into the immaterium, a road through damnation, better than Varos, better than digestion pools, capillary towers, and silence. Then the shadow in the warp pressed down. The fissure screamed louder. The escape route bent beneath the vast psychic gravity of the hive mind. It warped, narrowed, widened, twisted back upon itself. The clean geometries of Malachor's rite buckled. The sigils he had cut with such patience flared and ruptured, one after another, spraying sparks of burning meaning into the air. The warp beyond did not open like a door. It convulsed like a throat choking on broken glass. Demons came through anyway. They spilled into the crypt half-formed and insane, dragged by the scent of blood and the promise of a world already drowning. A claw emerged first, then a horned skull with no body attached, then a length of spine dragging coils of smoke behind it. A bloodletter clawed itself into being from the edge of the wound, but its legs were smoke, and its blade was a ribbon of molten brass that screamed with its own mouth. Something with wings and a furnace heart struck the floor, folded inside out, and immediately began tearing at its own skin to find a shape that would survive. Malachor backed away. The demons were not reinforcements. They were casualties arriving early. The shadow crushed them as they manifested. The fissure snapped and buckled around their forms. Some burst into clouds of ash before they had fully entered the world. Others crawled forward, shrieking, only to be caught by the first Tyranid organisms that found the crypt through the lower cracks. Gaunts poured in through broken drainage mouths. Rippers spilled from the walls. A ravener burst up through the stone floor and dragged a horned warp thing down into the dust before either monster could understand the other. The crypt became a grinder between two hungers. Demons hacked at Tyranids with blades that bled fire. Gaunts tore into unstable warp flesh with teeth and talons. Rippers crawled over half-real limbs and died in spasms, only for more to take their place. A malformed predator from the Empyrean seized a hormigaunt in each hand and pulled them apart, laughing through three mouths until a warrior drove bone blades through its chest and pinned it against the trembling fissure. The demon dissolved around the blades, screaming, its hatred wasted on creatures that could not savor it. Malachor saw his path narrowing. He began another chant. Above him, the fortress groaned. Varak came down through the catacombs like judgment, with armor cracked and blade drawn. He did not follow maps. He followed betrayal. Malachor's scent was in the air, blood and sorcery, fear hidden beneath arrogance. The Chaos Lord descended through old trophy halls, where the Ashen Moor had stored the proof of 10,000 years of survival. He passed helms taken from loyalist champions, banners stripped from dead regiments, Xeno's skulls mounted in iron, chain-bound reliquaries filled with saint bones, vault doors marked with the names of brothers who had died before the long war became myth to lesser men. The catacombs were collapsing around him. Dust fell in choking veils. Stone ribs cracked overhead. Tyranid impacts shuddered through the foundations as trigons and carnifexes battered the fortress from below and without. Slaves ran through the passages in blind panic, some carrying relics they had been ordered to save, others carrying nothing but terror. Varak killed those who blocked his path. He did not slow for pleas, apologies, or worship. At a junction lined with skulls lacquered in black resin, 3 mortal wardens tried to bar his way. "Lord, the lower vaults are breached," one stammered. "The witch has opened something beneath the inner seal." Varak seized him by the face and crushed until the man's skull folded inward beneath his gauntlet. "I know." The others fled. He let them. Something in the dark ahead would eat them soon enough. The Chaos Lord moved on. In the Apothecarian's deepest annex, Nerez Halvek opened the final cages. He had named the experiment the Reversal of Hunger, though he had never intended any other living being to hear the name. The specimens writhed in containment tubes filled with black nutrient fluid. Tyranid organisms, some lesser gaunts, some feeder beasts, some malformed things grown from tissue fragments, had been saturated with warp-reactive matter, demon host blood, mutagenic plague cultures, and powdered bone from possessed warriors. Their flesh had resisted, rejected, selected, metabolized. Most had died. Some had adapted. A few had become something new enough to be useful or disastrous. Nerez was out of time for the distinction. The apothecarian shook as the upper fortress took another blow. Lights died in sequence. His assistants, vat thralls and surgical servitors, waited around him in the red emergency glow. Beyond the inner door, rippers scraped at the seal in thousands. "Release them," Neres said. One assistant hesitated, its stitched mouth working around a sound it had not been built to make. Neres turned his helm toward it. Obedience is the only mercy left. The locks opened. The first organism fell from its tube and struck the floor in a convulsion of limbs. Its chitin was cracked by black growths that shivered between flesh and smoke. Its mouth opened too wide, splitting the head down the middle, revealing teeth growing on teeth. The second burst from its suspension fluid before the clamps released, tearing itself free with strength far beyond its frame. The third had no stable shape at all, only a knot of talons, digestive sacs, and warp-swollen tissue. For 3 breaths, Neres believed. The creatures attacked the riptide when the door failed. They tore through feeder organisms with frantic violence, exhaling fumes that made smaller Tyranids blister and burst. One mutant gaunt vomited black fire across the floor, leaving a trench of charred chitin and boiling slime. Another consumed 3 rippers, swelled, split open, and birthed a cloud of biting larvae that attacked everything they touched. Then, the experiment forgot its enemy. A warp-infected feeder beast leapt onto a surgical servitor and pushed itself through the machine's chest cavity, dragging wires and dead organs into its own distended mouth. Another organism struck an assistant, opened its abdomen and entered, wearing the thrashing body for several steps before both exploded in a spray of acidic blood and mutagenic foam. The black fire spread across the apothecarian floor, burning Tyranids, thralls, preserved gene tissue, and the legs of one plague marine who laughed until the flames reached the ammunition at his belt. Neres stood amid the collapse, recording until the last possible moment. "Unstable," he said. "Hostile to all biomass. No loyalty to source tissue. No obedience to synaptic pressure detected in late mutation. No useful control." A warped gaunt lunged at him. He caught it by the throat with his narthecium claw and injected enough alchemical poison to kill a herd of groks. It died, revived, sprouted a new jaw from its chest, and bit through his forearm plating. Neres tore it loose and crushed it beneath his boot, even as rippers flowed around his feet, and the rest of his creations slaughtered his assistants. He looked toward the sealed vault, where the last gene seed caskets had been stored. The door was already wet with digestive fluid from the inside. "Unacceptable," he whispered. Deep beneath the western manufactorum roots, Dragon Mole reached the cyclonic silo. It had been buried before Varrock claimed Varos, an imperial dead hand system sealed beneath kilometers of reinforced stone and iron. The Ashen Maw had found it, corrupted its locks, murdered its machine priests, and kept the warheads as a final insult against any foe who thought possession of the planet meant safety. Dragon had argued for their use while there was still time to withdraw. Now there was no withdrawal, only denial. The silo command chamber was circular, low-ceilinged and hot with machine breath. Mortal crewmen worked at rune banks under the guns of iron apostates. Servitors plugged themselves into launch cogitators, twitching as ancient systems awakened. Warning chants spilled from cracked speakers. Beneath the chamber, the last cyclonic warheads waited in their cradles, enough to burn Varos sterile if the launch path held, and the gods of machinery did not mock them. Dragon connected his own mechadendrites to the primary console. The machine spirit resisted him. He broke it with scrap code and blasphemous Binharik. "Launch sequence," he ordered. A crewman looked up, face slick with sweat. "Lord, atmosphere interference from spore density is beyond tolerance." "Acceptable." "Orbital detonation patterns are compromised." "Acceptable." "Surface forces remain within kill radius." Dragon stared at him. The crewman lowered his eyes. Acceptable. The silo shook, not from launch, from entry. The first lictor came through the ceiling without sound. It had crawled through ventilation shafts too narrow for armored men, shedding armor plates, compressing its body, following pheromone trails and command scent through the walls. It killed the closest crewman by removing his head with a talon stroke so precise the body remained standing at the console. The second lictor unfolded from the shadow behind a coolant shrine. The third was already among them when the alarms began. Dragon fired his combi bolter into the first and blew its chest open. It vanished behind a column before the second volley. Raveners erupted from the floor grates, serpentine bodies smashing through metal, talons scything. One wrapped around an iron apostate and crushed him until his armor burst at the seams. Another plunged into the crew pits, shredding men, consoles, and launch keys in a frenzy of targeted ruin. "Protect the sequence," Dragon commanded. His warriors tried. The lictors did not fight like beasts. They killed function. One sliced through the primary data trunk. Another impaled the ranking launch adept through the spine and dragged him backward into the dark. A Ravener smashed the arming lectern, sending fragments of brass and bone across the chamber. Servitors continued chanting launch scripture, while feeder tendrils entered their skulls and pulled out the wet logic of their obedience. Dragon reached the manual trigger cradle. A lictor landed on his back. Its talons punched through his armor and into the meat beneath. His servo arms seized it, drills and saws biting, and ripped it over his shoulder. It struck the floor, wounded but moving. Dragon crushed its skull beneath his iron boot, then turned toward the trigger. The console was gone. A Ravener had torn through the base of the cradle and dragged the firing core into the floor breach. Sparks fell where planetary death had been reduced to useless metal. Dragon stood in the ruin of the silo as the warheads below remained silent in their cradles. Useless monuments. He understood then that denial had also been denied. In the lowest crypt, Varric found Malachor before the fissure. The sorcerer stood at the edge of the screaming wound, one hand raised, blood pouring from his fingers into the light. Around him, demons and Tyranids tore each other apart in unstable flashes. The chamber roof had cracked. Through the fissures above, dust and rippers fell together. The air stank of ozone, blood, acid, and warp rot. Malachor turned as Varric entered. His smile was terrible because it was peaceful. "You are late," the sorcerer said. Varric crossed the chamber and struck him hard enough to break his jaw. Malachor hit the floor, rolled, and tried to speak a ward. Varric kicked him in the ribs. Bone cracked. The sorcerer gasped, choking on blood. Varric lifted him by the throat and slammed him against a pillar carved from slave bones. "You opened a path without my command." Malachor coughed. "A path? Look at it, Lord. Look at what remains of paths." Varric struck him again, teeth scattered across the floor. "You would flee." "Yes." The honesty enraged him more than denial would have. Varric beat him with his gauntlets until the sorcerer's face was a red ruin, until one eye collapsed, until the brass hooks and charms on his armor snapped and fell away. Malachor laughed through it, not loudly, not triumphantly, softly, as if at some private revelation. Varric leaned close. "What amuses you?" Malachor's remaining eye focused on him with effort. "It has won," he whispered. "Not because it is stronger than rage, not because its claws are sharper, because it never needed what we need." Varric tightened his grip. Malachor's broken mouth widened. No pride, no faith, no hatred, no glory, no fear of being forgotten, no hunger to be witnessed. It does not care that you are Varric Threx. It does not care that I am Malachor Vare. It does not care what banners we raised or what gods we called. It eats, and by eating, continues. That is all. That was enough. Above them, the basilica began to die. The foundations split with a roar that drowned the warp fissure. Trigons breached through the lower supports, their bodies smashing aside pillars older than the Warband's claim to the world. Carnifexes followed through collapsing tunnels, battering open vault walls with their skulls and claws. Endless gaunts poured through the ruptures, claws scraping stone, bodies slick with dust and blood. Entire trophy halls fell into darkness. Gene vaults cracked. Slave bone catacombs spilled their dead into the living tide. The fortress above collapsed inward, level by level, like a cathedral kneeling before hunger. Varrock heard it all. The world he owned was coming down around him. Malachor laughed again, weaker now. The Chaos Lord drew his blade and drove it through the sorcerer's chest. Malachor stiffened. Blood ran over Varrock's gauntlet. His remaining eye stared past the tusked helm toward the fissure, toward the impossible light already folding in on itself. "Fool," he breathed. Varrock twisted the blade. Malachor died smiling. The warp fissure shuddered. Without the sorcerer's will, without his words and blood and miserable genius, the wound began to close in spasms. Demons trapped halfway through were cut apart by reality snapping shut. The violet light dimmed. The voices faded, mocking him until silence swallowed them. Varrock stared at the closing wound. Only then did he understand. He had murdered the last warrior capable of opening a way out. The fissure sealed with a final scream. Darkness returned, broken only by emergency lumen strips, and the glow of fires above. Varrock stood alone in the deepest vault beneath the world that had been his. Around him lay slave bones, broken trophies, dead demons, severed Tyranid limbs, and the corpse of his betrayer. Above him, Varos collapsed. Around him, cracks spread through the floor and walls. From those cracks came the first feeder organisms. Rippers poured through like a living tide, pale bodies slick with dust, blind mouths snapping, tendrils tasting the air. More followed, then more. They flowed around fallen stones, over dead demons, across Malachor's corpse, toward the last living thing in the vault. Varrock Threx raised his blade. For the first time in 10,000 years, there was no one left to hear his threat. Varos was no longer a battlefield. Battlefields had direction, lines, objectives, ground taken, ground lost, banners raised, banners trampled into mud. Battlefields had commanders lying to themselves that the next order might matter. Varos had passed beyond that mercy. It had become a feeding ground, and the difference was written across every horizon in pale towers, black rivers, and the slow peristaltic pulse of a world being swallowed. The Manufactorum continent still burned, but the fires no longer belonged to war. They were chemical reactions in a carcass. Black Furnace Hive had folded inward, its proud walls split and sucked hollow, its avenues flooded with digestion fluids that steamed as they reduced corpses, armor, weapons, prayer books, ration tins, ammunition crates, and sacred icons into slurry. The slave pits had become lakes of rendered meat. The old blood reservoirs, once used by the Ashen Moor for ritual and industry, had been drained into capillary towers that rose from the plains, like the bones of a dead god turned into feeding tubes. Corpse rivers flowed through the ruins. They carried men, mutants, cultists, penal soldiers, broken legionaries, dead gaunts, severed limbs, loosened skulls, strips of flayed banner cloth, devotional chains, ammunition belts, and the softened remains of things that had once known names. Rippers moved through the rivers in pale knots, separating what could be rendered from what needed more acid. Larger feeder beasts waded in the pools, their bellies swollen, their jaws working without pause. Harvester organisms clung to towers and walls, scraping mineral value from stone, iron from blood, oil from machinery, calcium from bones. Above it all, the bioships waited. The sky was almost gone beneath them. Vast shapes drifted through the upper atmosphere and low orbit, their feeder tendrils descending into the clouds, their bellies swelling with the stolen mass of Varos. Capillary towers pumped upward, each pulse carrying oceans of dissolved life into the waiting vessels. There was no triumph in it, no ceremony, no cruelty, no malice, The world was being processed. Beneath the Basilica of Cinders, in the cracked gene vault, the last of the Ashen Maw gathered around Varrock Threx. They came in ones and broken pairs, dragging themselves through corridors already white with feeder organisms. Terminators with empty magazines, raptors with shattered jump packs scraping sparks from the floor, plague-swollen warriors leaking black fluids from breached armor, iron apostates with servo limbs torn away, champions whose names had once made slave cities tear out their own throats in terror. They came because the passages behind them were gone, because the vault door ahead had failed, because Varrock still lived, and because dying near a lord was the last habit left to them. The gene vault had been the heart beneath the heart of the Warband. Its walls were adamantium, carved with the names of brothers who had died in raids across 10,000 years. Its reliquaries had once held progenoid glands preserved in stasis, genetic futures stolen, cultivated, guarded and worshipped with the jealous reverence only traitors could offer to legacy. Its trophy alcoves contained weapons taken from loyalist captains, cracked helms of rival warbands, Saint Bones, Xenos skulls, the first chain that had bound the demon engine Garl, and banners that had crossed the stars in defiance of the corpse emperor. Now the vault stank of acid. The gene caskets were open. Some had been cracked by falling stone. Others had been gnawed through from within by feeder organisms that had entered through microscopic fractures and dead flesh. Preservation fluids ran across the floor in shining streams, mingling with Tyranid digestive enzymes. Progenoid glands floated there, pale and dissolving, sacred futures reduced to jelly. The names carved into the walls were hidden beneath crawling bodies. Varrock stood at the center of it all. His armor was split in a dozen places. Acid had burned through the old brass trim and eaten grooves into the ceramite beneath. One eye lens of his tusked helm had gone black. His blade still burned with demon light, though the flame guttered weakly, as if even the thing bound within it had begun to understand the scale of the hunger pressing close. His bolter hung empty at his hip. His cloak of faces was gone, torn away somewhere in the catacombs, leaving only blackened hooks across his shoulders. Dragon Mole came to him last among the commanders, who still had the shape of men. The warsmith's armor had been breached from hip to throat. 2 servo arms were missing. Another dragged behind him, twitching and sparking. His helm had been torn open on one side, revealing metal, scar tissue, and a single human eye sunk deep in a mask of burned flesh. Something pulsed beneath his breastplate, not a mortal heart, but the reactor core that had kept him moving long after his body should have failed. Nerez Halvek stood near the broken gene caskets, one arm gone below the elbow, his narthecium hanging in cables and wet tubing. He stared at the dissolving organs with a stillness more terrible than rage. Around his boots, feeder organisms circled and tested the air. Malachor was dead. Korvax should have been dead. Then the corpse mound at the vault entrance moved. A red gauntlet punched through a clot of rippers and severed gaunt limbs. The body beneath it rose in pieces. Korvax's red hand dragged himself into the vault with half his helm crushed inward and his left arm missing at the shoulder. His chain axe was still locked in the grip of that severed arm, which hung from a loop of torn cabling and muscle, the weapon snarling in weak, intermittent bursts, as if it shared its master's refusal to stop. Rippers crawled across his back. One disappeared into the wound beneath his ribs. He laughed as he crushed another between his teeth and spat the paste onto the floor. "Late," Dragon rasped. Korvax turned the broken ruin of his helm toward him. "Still killing?" Varrock looked at the last of them. Not enough to crew a raider, not enough to take a hab block, not enough to matter against the tide pressing through the vault passages. Yet they were his broken blades, his damned sons, his murderers, cowards, butchers, rivals and tools. He raised his sword. "This world is gone," he said. No one denied it. The ships are gone, the slaves are gone, The vaults are spoiled. Our trophies are being swallowed by things too witless to fear what they consume. The rippers at the entrance thickened into a living carpet. Beyond them came gaunts, crawling over one another through the cracks, blind eyes and wet teeth shining in the emergency lumen glow. Varroc's voice deepened through the damaged vox grill. So be it. Let the beasts eat a poisoned feast. Let them choke on every shell, every blade, every drop of blood left in us. We do not die as saints. We do not die as heroes. We die as we lived, killing what stands before us, because hatred is all the galaxy ever deserved. Korvax laughed. Nerez said nothing. Dragon's reactor heart pulsed brighter beneath his ruined breastplate. The swarm entered. Bolters fired at point-blank range. The sound inside the vault was not a volley, but a continuous detonation of enclosed thunder. Bolt shells burst among the rippers and gaunts, splashing the walls with chitin fragments and purple-black ichor. Terminators stood shoulder to shoulder and fired until magazines clicked empty, then used their guns as clubs. Chainblades screamed. Power fists crushed skulls. Lightning claws cut arcs through leaping bodies. The first wave died. The second came over it. A raptor with one wing of his jump pack still burning leapt into the mass and vanished beneath talons. His chainsword rose and fell several times before the teeth jammed on bone. A gaunt tore the arm away. Another opened his abdomen. His scream broke into wet static as rippers poured through the wound and inflated his armor from inside with their feeding. A Terminator took a warrior's blade through the chest and answered by driving a chain fist into the beast's head, grinding until the skull became paste. He was still laughing when feeder organisms climbed through the hole in his armor and ate his lungs. Korvax met the tide at the entrance. He had no balance left, no shield, no left arm, and barely enough blood to stand. It did not matter. His severed arm still held the chain axe, and he swung the limb like a flail, the weapon coughing back to life whenever it struck flesh. Gaunts piled onto him. He tore out throats with his teeth. He stomped rippers into slime. A warrior drove a blade through his stomach and lifted him from the ground. Korvax grabbed the blade with his remaining hand, pulled himself down along it, and bit into the creature's face hard enough to rip away a mouthful of chitin and nerve tissue. The swarm buried him again. This time, there was no crater, no explosion, no miracle of fury. Just weight. Thousands of lesser organisms climbed over him, around him, into him. His chain axe kept moving beneath the mound, chewing blindly through bodies, even after the arm that held it was severed again. Even after Korvax's laughter became a drowning rattle, even after his vox went silent. For a while, the mound twitched. Then it became still, and the weapon finally died with a last metallic cough. Nerez fired until his pistol overheated and fused to his gauntlet. The apothecary butcher turned to blades, syringes, bone saws, scalpels, and acid injectors. He killed with surgical precision, even as the vault collapsed into chaos. A gaunt lunged at him, and he opened its throat from beneath the jaw, cataloguing the thickness of the connective tissue, even as another organism tore into his hip. Rippers climbed his back. He seized one, split it open, and stared at the organs inside, while its kin chewed through his armor seals. "You are crude," he snarled. "Efficient, but crude." They ignored him. That was the final humiliation. Not death, not failure, indifference. Nerez cursed them in the names of every god, every gene sire, every broken oath and butchered world. He promised plagues that would make hive fleets rot in the void. He promised vivisections, cages, mutation, knowledge turned into knives. A feeder beast sprang onto his chest and forced him backward against a broken stasis casket. He drove his remaining claw through its skull. 3 more took its place. One entered the missing socket of his arm and burrowed upward. Another found the gap beneath his gorget. He tried to speak one final observation. The organisms ate his tongue before he formed the words. Dragon Mole waited until the swarm reached the vault center. He had been fighting without moving, firing, cutting, directing the last warriors with gestures and clipped commands. When his ammunition ended, he used his broken servo arm to impale gaunts and pin them to the floor. When that failed, he tore the arm free from his own back and used it as a spear. His human eye remained fixed on the breach, measuring density, distance, pressure, and futility. Then he looked at Varrock. Denial remains possible in part. Varrock understood. Do it. Dregon's remaining servo limbs folded inward and punched through his own breastplate. He did not flinch. He had stripped fear from himself in pieces across centuries. His claws dug into the reactor heart and tore away the control sheaths. White light spilled through the cracks in his armor. "For iron," he said. The reactor heart detonated. The blast turned the center of the vault into a sun. Rippers vanished in white fire. Gaunts became silhouettes, then ash. Chaos Marines near Dregon were erased along with the swarm. Gene caskets melted. Trophy alcoves collapsed. The shockwave punched through walls, shattered relic weapons, pulverized skull racks, and hurled Varrock across the chamber hard enough to crack the stone behind him. For several breaths, there was only flame. Then the smoke moved. Rippers crawled through it. Fewer now, charred, twitching, dying as they came. But behind them, through the broken passages and the newly opened cracks, came more. Always more. The detonation had annihilated part of the vault and bought less than a minute. Varrock rose slowly. His sword was gone. His bolter was empty. His left arm hung by fiber bundles and torn muscle beneath the armor. His chest plate had split open, showing black carapace, broken ribs, and blood pumping too slowly from wounds. Acid had widened. His helm had cracked across the mouth grill, and when he breathed, the sound came wet and human. A gaunt leapt at him. He caught it by the throat and smashed its head against the wall until there was no head left. Another struck his back and drove talons through weakened ceramite. He reached over his shoulder, seized it, and tore it in half. Rippers climbed his legs. He crushed them with each step. A warrior entered the vault, towering over the feeder tide, blade limbs raised. Varrock charged it barehanded. The warrior stabbed him through the abdomen. Varrock kept coming. He drove his fist into its face, once, twice, again, breaking chitin, breaking bone, breaking his own gauntlet. The creature struck him with another limb, opening his side. He caught the limb and tore until the joint gave way. The warrior lowered its head to bite. Varrock seized its jaws and pulled them apart with a roar that became a scream as his armor finally failed under the pressure. The warrior's skull split. Varrock fell with it. The feeder organisms reached him before he could stand. They came in layers, claws first, teeth after, acid next. They found every wound. They entered every breach. They chewed through the flesh beneath his armor with the same attention they had given slaves, saints, mutants, officers, demons, and gene seed. He tried to rise and could not. He tried to curse and swallowed blood. His remaining eye lens cleared for one final moment. He saw the vault. The banners were down. The skull trophies were being stripped, their surfaces softened by digestive fluid, their proud names reduced to mineral value. Armor plates floated in acid pools, paint and heraldry peeling away. Gene seed dissolved in the same slurry as slave meat and Tyranid dead. The relics of 10,000 years vanished beneath pale bodies that neither knew nor cared what they consumed. There would be no demonic coronation, no eternal duel, no song of the Ashen Maw in the warp, no skull throne raised from their final stand, only digestion. Varrock understood, too late, the truth Malachor had died laughing to speak. Terror had no meaning against hunger. His helm came apart under the pressure of feeding claws. His face met the air of Varos one final time, hot, poisoned, and thick with spores. A ripper climbed onto his chest and pressed its blind mouth to the wound over one of his hearts. Varrock Threx tried to say that all things screamed. The swarm ate the words before they left him. Afterward, there was no afterward for the Ashen Maw.
There were only processes. The vault cooled, the fires diminished, the bodies were opened, reduced, sorted by instinct older than language and direction broader than thought. Ceramite was stripped of clinging tissue, bone was dissolved, gene matter was tested, broken, absorbed or discarded. Brass icons were dragged into pools where acid ate the prayers from them. Demon-touched fragments were separated, rejected when useless, metabolized when useful, buried when troublesome. The skull racks softened, the banners sank. The names of the dead became no different from rust, ash or marrow. Across Varos, capillary towers pulsed. They drank the last corpse rivers. They emptied the final blood pits. They sucked the manufactorum sumps dry, rendered the slave warrens hollow, drained the marrow from mass graves, and pulled the biological wealth of a damned world upward into the bellies of the fleet. Chitinous harvesters moved across sterile plains, collecting scraps too small for the rivers. Feeder organisms entered the ruins of Black Furnace Hive and came out swollen. Digestion pools steamed beneath the silent red star. The last screams ended. The last Vox beacon died beneath a coating of living mold. The last pocket of resistance became heat, then fluid, then mass. Varos turned pale. Its hives stood empty, their walls pitted, their engines cold, their shrines hollowed of bone and meat. The basilica of cinders sagged into its own foundations, stripped of worshippers and masters alike. The slave pits held no slaves. The foundries forged nothing. The trophy halls remembered no one. Above the dead world, Hive fleet Karkanos fed. Biomass rose through the towers into the waiting vessels. The bioships swelled, repaired, grew, divided purpose among their organs and broods. The losses of the war became information. The poisons became lessons. The blades, shells, warp taint, demon fire and stubborn hatred of the Ashen Maw became data.
Folded into flesh. New organisms stirred in birthing chambers. New adaptations hardened beneath shell. When Varos had nothing left to give, the capillary towers withered. The fleet loosened from orbit. Behind it remained a sterile world beneath a bruised red star, scraped clean of glory, cruelty, faith, rebellion, memory, and sin. Ahead lay another system. The hive mind turned toward it without haste, without hatred, without triumph. Only hunger remained.